morning. Bonjour, comment ça va? Thank you all for joining us bright and early for a conversation that we actually should have had a long time ago. What we're doing over here at the Baker Institute in the Center for Energy Studies to add knowledge, content, and capacity on non-fuel minerals and materials. Although as the conversations go along, you'll find out that in fact, materials writ large, everything that comes out of the chemicals, petrochemical streams, everything that we're thinking about doing with advanced carbon, metals and industrial minerals, it's all fair game at this point. There is a lot in going on. There's a lot in the news. There's stuff in the news this week. And so for sure, everybody has seen that. What I have found over the years as we've been building this is that we have lots of different ideas out there about what all of this is, why it matters, what the issues are. And so the conversation this morning is intended to build some of those connections. And for our audiences here for the center and at the Baker Institute, to give you all an understanding of what we're thinking about, talking about, looking at, so that you can engage with us. And I hope that we accomplish that. I think we will, because I've got some great people lined up that you're going to hear from as we go through the agenda and build the storylines that we're building. I've got up with me initially Katie Zimmerman at Wood, my great colleague here in the Baker Institute in the center, Rachel Meidel, and then we'll have Deb Byers, who will be with us remotely, but never fails to weigh in no matter where she is. Justin Bowman, who's with us from KPMG, Kristen Hingstebeck, who very kindly traveled here to join us from the metals company. I've been interacting with them for a long time. Very interesting stuff there. Longtime pal, Joe Figueredo. And I have an important announcement to make about Joe. Joe is at Deloitte. We've known each other for a long time, but more important than that, he is the proud other parent of a brand new factor of production for the US economy. So congratulate Joe. I'm amazed that he's here, and he told me the other day, the very important thing about that was that he asked his wife before the delivery to get her permission to be with us today. So you all are doubly benefited by Joe's presence here. And then we've got two people that I know a lot of you all know from our group, Gabe Collins. Gabe and I have been stirring the pot a lot on different things, and Ken Medlock, who's our senior director at the center. So everyone has a lot to contribute, but I'm going to make sure that we hear from you all. That's the point as we go along, to get your questions. And we're just going to do this live from the audience. I didn't want written questions, but they have to be short and succinct and to the point as we go through all of this. So to set the stage, what I want to do is I want to show you a little bit of some of the work that's been going on in-house, and what we're doing with it and how it's informing our thinking. And one of the most important things, and we're going to be doing a lot to improve the placement of all of our visualizations. We've been building great visualizations over the years, and a lot of new stuff is rolling out. We want it to be really easy for people to find this. In the case of minerals production, if you go to the Baker Institute website, what you'll see is this tableau-based view of the world, where stuff is getting produced, from what countries, with some longitudinal data, because we've been building a longitudinal series as we're doing this. We have got information on market shares. We're going to talk about that a lot today. We have information on the producing countries themselves, and we have links, and people can go from areas of interest to drill down deeper into things that you might be working on, either specifically for businesses or personal interests, professional interests, whatever. One thing that I know is that cuts of our maps were used by NATO for a couple of projects that we advised on as NATO members struggle with the security around materials, or let's say the insecurity around material supply chains that are essential for defense. And so I know that people are accessing this and using this, and as it develops, we're also going to be improving some other visualization work that we've done on trade flows and other things. All right, the topic of the day, and this phrase is going to get used a lot, critical minerals, and I call it list mania. In fact, there's even proposed legislation to try to get everybody in the United States on like one list. And I'm like, well, we have a list. It's called the periodic table. 118 elements. And the problem that we have is, okay, trying to worry about 118 elements, or 119, depending on, opinions of scientists. Well, obviously that doesn't work. So then the question is, well, what's the magic number? So the current list is like about 50, I think. Notably and importantly, especially in terms of political interests and agendas, it excludes copper. So if you go to anything that gets published by the USGS that's related to critical minerals, you will find nothing about copper. And what's in the news most of the time, right? Copper, along with the other one that everybody thinks every mineral is. Rare earth elements, right? Everybody thinks every mineral is a rare earth element. The most important thing about this visual is that all the yellow and the red is the stuff that we worry about. The really important theme for the day, the theme for you, is the reason why it's yellow and red is because these are choices. It's not that we don't have the resources. We have the resources. For most of them, we have commercial resources. We choose not to use them. These are choices that we make that get exercised in the typical ways. Policy, regulatory barriers, public concerns, other things, misunderstandings in the capital markets about what the mining industry is all about, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of things that we're going to talk about that could help to fix this, but this is the reality. The problem that we face, the thing that's getting talked about, our vulnerabilities in the United States, how that affects our relationships to the rest of the world, how it affects our trade, our relationships with our trading partners and our trade flows. A lot of that is because of what we've chosen to do over the past decades to affect our own domestic extraction businesses. And to address this, to me, we have to ask some really, really big questions, and we're not really dealing with those. What materials? What minerals? From where? For whom? For what purpose? With what preconditions? And I'm going back to the old SHE formula here: safety, security, health, environment. From an operational basis, that is what matters. Do you want to lose time? Do you want people injured? Do you want something worse? Of course not. So the face of the industry, first and foremost, is how safe it is. This is what builds public support and public confidence. So those choices, it happens that the death of the mining industry in the United States happened while I was in graduate school at the Colorado School of Mines. So I started there, and I'm not kidding here. 1982, I think, was the first year of my program. A kid could graduate from mines and still get a job in the mining industry. By the time I pop out in 1985, the Business Week cover story is out there claiming the death knell, which actually really was. And a kid graduating from mines had to go to Botswana to work in the mining industry. That's what happened. We had a mining industry that shrank by close to a half. We had rules that came into place that caused us to shut down refining and processing, which is our biggest problem and will be the most difficult to address. So what I've done in this flagship report, we consider it a flagship report, is online. It's long, it's dense, but it covers the bases on things that I consider the 9 challenges. And the problem that I have is I can't look at any one of these puzzle pieces alone. So I have trouble prioritizing or suggesting to people which are the things that we really need to focus on. We've got the occurrences, but let me tell you, sometimes the geology is just not great. And worldwide, one of the things that we know is that those occurrences are changing because we've extracted really good ores, also because we have to go to more and more remote places in order to get better ore grades. The concern here is the amount of metal, the end product, the target that you're after, the prize, per ton of rock. And it's getting lower and lower, which makes all of the problems in the mining industry worse and worse. And we're going to get into that with Katie as we go along. Commercialization is really tough. Supply chains are complex. Pricing is opaque. There's lots of difficulties and challenges in quality because all of the stuff that we use needs to be sometimes very pure. Other times it doesn't really matter so much. We've got an old asset base. Now, Mining assets are built to last. They operate for decades, sometimes centuries, almost. All over the world, we have facilities that we depend on that have been in production since the early 1920s, the late 1800s. For all of us who have spent all of our lives around oil and gas, we know that this is true for the oil and gas side too, right? We keep stuff going because it's so hard to originate. But sooner or later, it catches up with you. Operating costs rise. Sustainability challenges become more difficult. It gets tougher and tougher to be able to extract in a way that makes sense. It's actually not as easy to flip assets in the mining industry as it is in the oil and gas business here in the United States. So we've got a lot of barriers to entry for junior mining companies. We've got various rules in different countries that make that complex. We have long cycle times. This probably people are aware of from just news coverage and chatter and everything else. Again, with Katie, we're going to get into this. Time is money. So the longer it takes to get something going, the more expensive, the bigger the drag it is on returns, the tougher it is for capital markets. Those things go together hand in glove. Supply chain dominance. This is my attempt at diplomatic phrasing for China's role in this whole thing. And we're just going to be blunt about that this morning. It is a factor. But again, like the big story, it happened because of the choices we made. So as our market shares shrunk because of our consolidations and dismantling of facilities here, the Chinese are industrializing. What do you think happens? You wake up one day and you were 40% of the finished aluminum market, and now you're 2% and China is 50%. And so those are the kinds of things that are playing out all the way across the businesses with a lot of different effects. And is probably the biggest thing affecting our trade dynamics and the politics around all of that. Competitiveness, this is our problem in the United States. This is the thing that I want us to talk about, not what do we do to solve this problem over here on this list of minerals. The issue is our labor costs are persistently high. The way we conduct environmental oversight is expensive. We've got fragmented controls and oversight at the federal level and sometimes at the state levels. We have federal land ownership that is a complicating factor in all of this. So there's a lot to think about there. Sustainability, when you have a lot of waste to deal with, then this is a challenge. In addition to that, we have all the pressures on the mining industry that everybody else has to decarbonize, to manage water use, to manage energy use, and so on. And there's been a lot of work going on all of that. Katie will talk about that. Markets, because of the presence of a large producer, customer, and trader in the one country of China, it's very difficult to get good pricing information. It's very hard to build liquidity in the non-fuel minerals commodities anyway. The big ones that get traded, gold, copper, iron, those aren't so much the problem, but it shrinks fast in terms of liquidity that's available to help with volatility, getting forward pricing, and so on. Old and new securities, so here at the Baker Institute for us, this is obviously the baseline. What are the relationships? What are the world regions? How do we deal with them? We have a lot going on in Latin America. So our Latin American focused group here is spending time now thinking about how to bring this into the picture. Middle East, we've got a relationship for the Future Minerals Forum, which is the Riyadh-based event that has really become a dominant event, the dominant event perhaps in the mining industry today, with new players and new interests and new funding sources and other things. So we're looking at all of this and the flashpoints in trade routes and other things and trying to think about that. And then the big open puzzle part, what are the opportunities? So we're going to get into that a little bit. Clearly, we have to think about alternatives, substitution, especially for us here at Rice. We've got folks over in engineering and material science inventing stuff. How do we get this into the markets? What can we do with it to offset some of those problems? One of my main concerns about how we make policy, how we've been making policy, this will come up with Joe and Gabe and Ken later on, is that a lot of what we're focused on is keeping us in the bucket of legacy materials. So how do we do what we need to do to think about, say, midterm pressures, while investing in the stuff that we need over the long term. And I think that is something that needs more airtime everywhere. So just to illustrate for you all quickly where things stand, just look at the dark color. The dark color is us. The inside circle is 1970. The outside circle is 2022, 23 data. So you can see how the situation for the United States has changed over time and how it's expanded for China, which is the medium colored part of the circles in all of these. There's some good news here and there. So when it comes to mined copper, we've got stuff going on in the United States to look at how to recover additional copper from waste. There's a lot to consider in that because you design your waste management practices to keep the public interest safe, to keep the environment safe. So as you start unpacking that to try to recover additional metal, you have to think about it. We also are looking at how do we build circuits and can they be commercially successful in places like our existing smelters, the two that remain for copper, one at Bingham Canyon where we're trying to capture tellurium, which is very interesting for advanced solar and electronics and other things. On the aluminum side, one of the ironies in the trade debate that's going on is one of the best providers of aluminum for us is in Quebec, right on the St. Lawrence River, fed by hydroelectricity. We're going to try to recreate that at great pain and great effort, and with not all the right thinking, in my opinion, about it. So this is something that people need to understand better. Who are our friends out there, whether it's Chile for copper, Quebec for sourcing aluminum? We have to think seriously about those and how we're going to work with them. When it comes to zinc, we've got examples. They need attention. They need understanding. We have examples of people going into brownfield operations where we've extracted zinc and who are looking at how do I get not only additional metal from waste, but look at virgin ores that weren't tapped into before. How can I process additional metals out of all of that? What would it cost me to add additional circuits to capture cobalt, copper, nickel, whatever? Can I, when I build my processing facilities, can I process recycled material? Can I bring in what we call black mass, which is the reduced version of our cell phones when we're done with them, and separate the useful materials out of all of that at the same facility where I'm also dealing with what I'm producing at the mine. Really interesting experiments in this, but here's where the regulatory stuff really has to get some fresh thinking. One of the ones that's getting attention is antimony, and I'll be very frank later on in the conversation with Gabe when we sort of lean towards defense. One of the big topics right now, it's not in the news as much as it should be. How are we going to rearm from everything that we've been supplying to Ukraine? This is becoming an issue, and this is the one thing that might bring people together to be able to maybe get improved conversations about all of this. All right, this is what the picture looks like then compared to the rest of the world. And this is, not really fair because we have major producers in some of these blocks, especially on the Latin America side, that are really important. But the most important thing is just the size of outbound investment from China to everywhere else. And we're not even close to that in terms of what the few American mining companies who have capital market access have been bringing into the picture to help sustain the global pie. And of course, the problem with China isn't just what it dominates in terms of the materials that have been in the news, rare earths this week, graphite, copper and copper smelting and all the plans to double smelting capacity in China and so on. But it's also that they also control manufacturing. So when we look at our trade, it's not just raw materials. It's what comes in the manufactured goods, because we're not making that either. So our tellurium comes to us in the products that we import from mainly Asia manufacturers. Do we want to make that stuff here? That's another big question. If so, what is it going to take? On rare earths, just let me say, for that part of the news mix and the news cycle, we do have things going on. This is actually one of the easier ones to fix in opinions around here. Hopefully in the fall, we will have MP Materials with us. At some point, MP operates Mountain Pass in California. When people look at rare earths, that's the one thing that they'll learn. MP is also building a magnet facility outside of Fort Worth that will address a lot of the sensitivities around how we use rare earths for large format, especially magnets that drive a lot of things like electric vehicle powertrains, wind turbine motors, things like that. All right, that's enough from me. So what I'm going to do now is flip over to Katie and Rachel. And because of air travel problems in Toronto, we don't have Ernest Scheyder. So Katie is going to pretend to be Ernie. And since both of us know Ernie and we know the book, and I think we're both acknowledged in the book, and Rachel has read the book, what I wanted to accomplish with Ernie, because he's been touring the country with this thing and talking to people about it, was to get input on what he's hearing from the audiences. How are people reacting to this? What are they reading? What are they thinking? And so I think Katie is going to be able to talk about that a little bit for a few minutes. So introduce yourself, tell us what you do at Wood, and then let's start with kind of your view of the world from the every man and every woman point of view.
All right, sounds like a fun time. So, hi everyone, I'm Katie Zimmerman. I'm the director for decarbonization at Wood. And what Wood does is a lot of engineering and consulting. So what we try to do is look at the energy and materials markets and figure out how do we make these projects a reality that supply us all the energy and materials that we need for our lives to go on. How many of you in the room are familiar with everything Michot just talked about from like a baseline? Okay, look at that. Now,
but we're a select audience, right?
Yeah.
This is the Baker Institute, it's Rice University. How many of you are Rice alums? So it's about the same.
Okay, there we go.
I'm just kidding.
It's different people, some overlap. Now, how many of you are familiar and feel more comfortable with oil and gas? All right, my people. Okay, so I am a native Houstonian. I went to school in Houston. I went to UT. My degree is in mechanical engineering, and I had a specialty in materials. No, I never used it. What I think is really interesting about what we're seeing now is there's really a big, exciting chance for innovation. And that's where I'm going to choose to focus most of the talk on is what can you all use your knowledge for to make a big step change difference. But putting my Ernie hat on, I met Ernie after his book came out. But what I really liked about Ernie's book is it's The War Below. How many of you have read The War Below? I know Barbara has. Barbara Berger's review actually encouraged me to read it, so I'm going to give her a shout out on that. But what's really neat about Ernie's book is what he tries to do is go through and say, here are all of these projects that provide all of the minerals that you hear about on the news every day. So the little byline at the bottom is lithium, copper, and the global battle to power our lives. So being in decarb for the last few years, what we really look at is how do we reduce emissions? And so much of that ends up pointing back to either a need for batteries or a need for lots of new power lines and transmission or wind turbines and their blades or some fancy magnets, electrolyzers, all of these things that are very materials intensive, right? And so then when you start thinking, well, where are we gonna get those? And you realize a whole lot of them all come from, spoiler alert, China. And then you start thinking, well, but we work on mining projects, we work on processing projects. We know how intensive that can be emissions-wise. So then how do we ensure that all of these projects that we're trying to do to decarbonize actually decarbonize? And that's kind of where I started coming at it more. I've always been interested in the crossover between oil and gas and mining in particular, and minerals processing, because a lot of it is, if you think about it from an oil and gas perspective, There's extraction, there's some sort of transport, and then there's some sort of processing and refining, right? And then somebody else typically is gonna make a product with that at the end. So if you break it down like that, like Michelle said, you can't control where the rocks are, where the formations are. But what is similar to oil and gas is you're not actually typically getting everything you want out of that formation when you go for it. And then sometimes it's the prompt. Another thing that I always like when I hear Michelle talk is, just like with oil and gas, when you go into a formation to get minerals out, you're typically not just getting the one that you're targeting at all. So then if it's one man's treasure, it's another man's trash, right? So we've had a lot of projects where we've extracted a lot of minerals over time, but they weren't used to their full potential because that's not what we were looking at. An oil and gas example for that I think is really neat is I like to talk about graphite. How many people have heard about graphite in the news lately? Like everybody? So graphite is really cool because it's right now one of the biggest components in batteries for everybody going, why the heck are we talking about graphite so much? And it's also being used as a lever that certain governments can pull to put a bit of pressure on the US. So graphite, you can get multiple ways. You can mine it or you can make it. And great news for us in the US, 80% of US refineries that we use for oil have cokers. So cokers, I kind of think of them as the trash can of the refinery. Don't tell them I said that. But really it's like everything left over, the bottom of the barrel goes into the coker, right? And so from there, what typically happens is the goal has always been get as much fuel out the top as you can. And then whatever is left over at the bottom, just kind of chuck it off to the side. There are lots of things that with what I just said, we can break down and get really cool stuff out of. So one thing is instead of telling people, I want more fuel out of the back, you can change the type of Coke that you make. Most people hear Coke and they think petroleum Coke. Okay, done. There's actually grades of Coke. There's fuel grade Coke, which is less fancy. And then you have anode Coke, which is fancier, but there are grades inside of anode Coke when you can get like a worth of $2 to $100 per unit. And then you have needle Coke. And needle Coke is called needle Coke because when you look at it under the microscope, it looks like a bunch of needles. And needle Coke you can use to make graphite. So there's that for cokers that I think is really exciting for us here. But what you have to do to make a normal coker into like a needle coker is really look at high grading your input, and you have to up the pressure, the temperature, and the residence time. It's kind of like baking, if you want to think about it that way. So you have to change the conditions in your oven, and you'll get a slightly different output. Another cool thing about cokers, another thing that you'll hear from people that do oil pipelines, oil and gas, we actually have a bit of nickel and vanadium. And normally, Coke, going back to what I said about the grades, if you have nickel and vanadium in your Coke, it's an impurity. Now, just to be inflammatory, I would say, what if it's the Coke that is the contaminant on our nickel and vanadium stream? These are the sorts of things that, even when we get to refining and processing, that changing what your prompt is, instead of telling engineers like me, I want the most fuel out of my coker. What if instead you ask me, here are these problems that I have for the mineral supply chain, how can you help? Very different outputs, right? Another thing is, I love the shale revolution. And another interesting thing, Ernie and I really liked how he talked about things because he spent time in shale in the Bakken. I spent lots of time in the Eagle Ford and the Permian. How many shale people are in the room? I'm gonna put 2 hands up, okay. So shale was really fun because when I first came into it, I was coming from offshore where you spend like 3 years plus on a single phase of a project. You look at every little bit of analysis because you're going to go deep into the ocean, you're going to drill a hole, and everything better works seamlessly from there because you've spent a lot of money to get to that point. Then we went to shale. And shale is you don't know what you're going to get, and it's all about, can I beat my neighbor and what they're going to get out of the same formation. So when I went in, we started with, you had to inject lots of fancy chemicals, lots of proppants that were made out of, it wasn't sand, it was like ceramics. And, we were looking at laterals that were not super long. And then by the time we left, it was, you can use whatever water you have next door, whatever sand, and you can inject, you can go and you can get so much more out of the formation. So that's the sort of ingenuity that we're looking for in this space as well. And it's really like on a, how can I get the most out of these resources that I do have, and how can I bring those costs down? Because a lot of the barriers for decarb projects that I've been working on for the last few years, it's not often technology in and of itself, it's the price point. And it's, do I know that it's gonna work? Can I meet a spec? Can I meet the output requirements to make my project economically viable? So that's where there are a lot of these crossovers that it's really easy, and I've heard Michelle say this before, it's really easy to focus on. The US does not have great mining programs at our universities on the whole anymore. It's a lot smaller. If you focus on just that and say, well, I guess we've lost, that's not really the answer. So we just talked about there are lots of crossovers that aren't necessarily like, I'm not gonna find tons of pyrometallurgists walking around Houston. But I am going to find tons of people who know how to get the most out of a formation, who know how to think differently about solving a problem. When I was coming out of school, we didn't have enough oil. I don't think anybody complains now that the US is dependent on lots of other people for oil, right? It's just a totally different game. So how can you use all this ingenuity, all of this engineering expertise, supply chain expertise, creativity, policy, and put it towards materials, minerals, and think, okay, well, maybe I don't need to ask people how to build the next lithium-ion battery that meets these specs. Maybe I say, how do I do long-duration energy storage? How do I get better conductivity in a line? How do I frame this question in a way that gets engineers excited and moving in game-changing steps and not just solving the next equation and doing the same thing over and over again? And then if I look at it from Ernie's perspective, if I put on my Ernie hat, what's really neat about his book that I liked is, I just talked about, like in decarb, we realize a lot of what we're doing is, what's the levelized cost of abatement? And we're always focusing on a dollar because that's what finance wants to see, that's what investors want to see, that's what industry is measured on. But what Ernie's book looks at is kind of that human element for all of these projects. Like if you're doing a big lithium project, but the lithium deposit is underneath a flower that only grows in that spot because of the lithium that's under it, what do you do? If your copper project is at a religious site, what do you do? So it's kind of, what are the needs of the world? What are the needs of the US, and kind of looking at how do we measure if a project is worth it or not. And something I appreciate too is he doesn't make value judgments. He just gives you a bunch of information from a bunch of different viewpoints, and he doesn't say, and I judged all of these people and this is what I picked. There's not a right answer on a lot of those, but there are probably wrong answers. And that's what makes it really difficult for us to figure out what should we be doing, where should we be going. But the other interesting part about it is, because I think he saw the shale revolution, the assumptions in the book are there needs to be a step change for us to evaluate where all of this comes from. And we, as the US consumer, need to be taking into account what are we buying and where does it come from. And it's not easy to find. Like, he talks about the battery in some of his lawn equipment. He says, like, you know, he's a journalist. He's much better at digging into things than I would be. But he went in and could not figure out, where did the components in my battery come from? Couldn't figure it out. And so how do we enable consumers to make choices based on some of that? Because a lot of times we are picking what we buy just simply based on price. You don't know what emissions were involved. You don't know the environmental standards that were involved. You don't know, like his point that if you get cobalt with the traditional supply chain, I think we've all heard, like, you're going to assume there was probably some sort of icky child labor involved. How do you make sure that it's not? And how much more are you willing to pay to ensure that that's the case? And a lot of what we're going to have to be able to do to make those decisions is have that awareness of the supply chain and that understanding of where do the different minerals come from and how do we use them. And on the list, the other thing I think is really interesting is if you look at Department of Interior, like Michelle said, the list's like 50. Then if you look at Department of Energy, they have a different list because they have different drivers. And then there's a different list, so there are 3 for the US. But the nice thing is, of those 3 lists, they all overlap nicely for 13 minerals. So I like to look at those 13 and think, what can I do for those? And if you think about it from an oil and gas, minerals, where can we all play nicely perspective, I think it's lithium, graphite, and there are 3 rare earths that I think of from that list. So if you can improve even just like graphite and lithium, how much more does that move us forward? And then rare earths often come with other things. Oh, I can tell you want to say something. What do you want to say? Okay. But we do see more rare earths projects. How many of you have seen Mountain Pass? It's not much to like drive by and see, but it was cool. My son had a tournament in Vegas last year. So being an engineer, I took him to Hoover Dam, which was really cool. If you haven't seen it, it's really inspiring to look at it and think, wow, a bunch of engineers all came together and they built this. Now we can talk about safety standards and how we would do that better, but they built something, and it was for a lot less than we would do it today when you adjust for costs and everything. So I just marvel at that. But then if you drive not far down the road, you can see Mountain Pass. And that's like the one rare earths mine that we can all think of in the US. And if you think even less than 10 years ago, Ernie has a great chapter in his book. There was like a soap opera that played out for what happens to Mountain Pass when it went into bankruptcy court. And it just floors me to think about where we are now and how willingly we had the rare earths mine in the US, which I like to think of rare earths. Ernie lays it out pretty well in the book about that's what makes your TV have color. That's what, gives us lots of magnets. So I think about my little cell phone and everything that goes into making that and how many different minerals play a key part. But Mountain Pass has really just come back into, everybody seems to know about Mountain Pass now. And we're all thinking about how do we ensure that they're not reliant on sending what they make out of that mine outside the US, because if we send it out, who's to say we'll get it back, right? So these are the sorts of things we have to go through for the US, and really it's not just can I get more out of the ground, because if I get more out and I send it all to Asia, it doesn't really matter, right? So how do I get it out and process it? And it doesn't all have to be in the US. I like that point. We have friendly countries. So when I did Department of Energy work, a lot of that relies on you have to use US content. A fun variance is for Department of Defense. You would kind of think like, oh, that might be more strict because it's defense, right? It's actually not. Domestic includes the US, our friends in Canada, the UK, and Australia. So from the US government, we've long had a stance of we're all in this together. So when you look at the big picture in the quilt, it's not just what do you have, but domestically, what do you have in the bigger picture?
All right, before I turn to Rachel, who's going to have a lot of reactions on this, let me just say that what Katie said, and I didn't know she was going to actually go down this path. I had a different idea. She made two great arguments. One, her discussion is why we added materials to the energy, minerals, materials name of the program. It was originally just going to be energy and minerals, and I was like, wait a minute. Everything comes from everything, and this is a materials issue, so we have to look across the board. So that's one thing. The other thing that I have to say is that on the mining school stuff, everybody I know in the mining industry is on my case about not getting behind the Mining Schools Act, and I don't want to, and it's because even though I'm a mines alum and I hang around with people from mines and Missouri S&T and the other programs, this is not a mining problem. It's a materials problem, and kids have to get trained in the way that you're talking about. It's holistic thinking, and Rachel's going to come back to that word in a minute. Let me just unpack one other quick thing for you all on the conversation about graphite. When Katie brought this to my attention a couple of weeks ago, this is an interesting thing for us to think about. Here in Houston, here at Rice. Why do we care about graphite? Because it goes into batteries, right? So it's in the electrode of the battery. It also goes into electrodes that are used in electric arc furnaces for steel making. So there are two big things going on. One is, can we use batteries to somehow help balance energy flows? And is it a good idea, bad idea, does it work or not? And I'm going to put up an image in a second to feed to Rachel on that. Whether it makes sense to do that, that's a question that has to be looked at. But when we look at steel making, the big problem in steel making is all of the emissions. Aluminum has the same problem. In the metals world, these two things plus cement, concrete, when it comes to building materials. Everybody is focused on those like lasers because they are very, very large emissions producing, energy intense businesses. And what we've traditionally used to run them are fossil fuels and things like petroleum coke, which are it's great for steel furnaces. But if you use electric arc furnaces and you have graphite electrodes, the graphite electrodes get consumed during the steel making process. So now you've got a problem of how to continuously supply the graphite in order to expand the use of EAFs. And they're very useful for scrap. And a lot of our steel gets made with scrap.
Right.
So one of the dilemmas in all of this is making sure that you're competitive with natural graphite.
Yes.
That's one of the big issues. And then the question is, does it make sense to constantly have to be making graphite to run EAFs? Boy, let me tell you, what this does is get this to a project area that Rachel and I have been working on, because Rachel's leading it, on life cycle analysis. You could get yourself so tangled up really fast with all of these questions about what to do and how to do it and what the trade-offs are. It's very, very difficult to analyze all of these things. So on that, I'm going to kick it over to Rachel for her reactions and my feeder, because this is exactly the problem. This little chart on the right is my first and initial poor attempt to capture the really big problem that we're struggling with, which is we want to be at the top end of that square. In the optimized part of that square, we want to be getting the most energy out of whatever the materials we are using. We want the least amount of materials use per unit of energy, right? We want it to be sustainable, and Rachel's going to redefine sustainability for us. But even more, we want it to be reliable. And I will tell you that if you walk into the office of a member of Congress today, that's the first thing that you're going to hear about. Because the last thing they want is a constituent to come in and tell them, oh my God, I had a power failure. For whatever reason, our utility is in trouble. I can't run my factory. I can't build my data center. That's a big thing these days, right? So absolutely no one in the political environment wants to have trouble when it comes to the reliability of energy. And that is really defining and redefining agendas these days. So Rachel, your reactions on some of this stuff.
Well, those are great comments. And so, and I think reading the book and then what you have highlighted underscores and lays the groundwork for why sustainability is so complicated, right? And I don't think there's one industry or one sector that defines it appropriately, that gives it the justice it needs to really unpack the complexities of that. And I mean, okay, so we all have heard about the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I think that's, it's pretty well known, but what is less understood, and this is where sustainability becomes very complicated, is understanding how those 17 aspirational goals that are built in pockets that each have their own milestones and roadmaps, how they interact with one another, and how do you balance those, and how do you prioritize them? Which one takes precedence over the other, and who decides? I mean, that is the question that I grapple with when all of these interdependencies come into play, and industries and governments are laying out their goals. And the way that we're looking at them is so highly prescriptive, embedded into prescriptive compliance frameworks and reporting frameworks, and looking at very narrow metrics that have become so ESG centric and so narrowly defined. And so when you look at the broader spectrum of sustainability, like how do you then as a company prioritize those things? And then, because perspective matters. I mean, we talk about this a lot, right? I mean, so can a mining industry, so mining for alternative energy materials that we know displaces communities and disrupt ecosystems, can they be characterized as sustainable just because they enable decarbonization and electrification in one part of the world? Yes, different people in different parties, they'll give you different answers. So perspective is really key in all of this, and it really comes down to value judgments, and that's where sustainability is challenging, and that's why companies and governments are grappling with this and are having a difficult time, not just in defining that, but operationalizing that, because sustainability for years now has been reduced to these narrow metrics and quantified, and we can't quantify everything. Not everything can fit nicely into numerators and denominators, and there's a whole qualitative aspect to it that Ernie lays out, and that you mentioned, Katie, too. I mean, things like cultural preservation and the life of an endangered species, land use, things like that. How do you quantify that? And then have an output or a series of metrics that can define what a sustainable action is and where the investments. And so this is where you see distortions in markets, shifting investments, and investments that are focused on certain areas like just decarbonization and electrifying everything, because the markets and the ESG investments and that are kind of channeled in that direction. But I spend a lot of time thinking about sustainability from a very holistic lens, and I know not everybody does, but for me, for those of you that don't know my background, I spent the first half of my career working primarily like in some type of waste management, and so that job that I had, or the jobs that I had, took me around the world, and so I was managing waste for upstream operations, so for like oil and gas, petrochemical, for mining, for a range of different industries and across sectors, and then also managing waste for at the end of life, waste management and recycling, and that gave me really interesting perspective on what does sustainability mean, and from the lens of different communities around the world, and where does waste management fit into this? And so that's where now bridging in the whole idea of circular economy and redefining, re-engineering how we do our operations, how we build and engineer materials to be more circular, how to design for recycling and dismantling, and tapping into those different different business models to create circularity across that entire life cycle. But then how do you do that sustainably, right? Because not all things circular, like recycling, it's not sustainable by default. And having run recycling facilities before, I can tell you it is a very energy and resource intensive operation. There's nothing innocuous or benign about it. We generate a ton of waste. And how efficient is it? It depends on what you're trying to pull out and recover and recycle, fractions of things, and then the waste managed elsewhere. And looking at global supply chains and knowing how enmeshed everything is, those wastes aren't necessarily captured in sustainability reporting. And I've been tracking waste for a long time now, almost 30 years, and just understanding, you mentioned the battery and how you can track all the different components that go into the battery. Well, try to do that at the end of life. It's impossible. It is 100% impossible to track and trace a battery and what happens to it after it is shipped to a dismantler, recycler, and then the valuable materials are pulled and kept with that recycler sold into markets. But what happens to all the other things, the other materials and metals that are sacrificed and then shipped elsewhere? Some is landfilled, some is incinerated, some is abandoned in the environment. And so sustainability from a life cycle lens, from that holistic lens, when you look at just that waste management perspective and then all of the other externalities that we're not capturing, is very, very complicated. And how do we do this in a way that companies can be economically viable, right? And that the stool that you see on the slide, that is how we try to elucidate and define sustainability. I guarantee if we polled this room, we would not have a unified definition of sustainability. When I talk to a lot of different groups, I oftentimes will poll them or ask students when we teach, how do you define sustainability? And across the board, from students, from different industries, from governments, it is the environmental leg of the sustainability stool that people most recognize as sustainable. And only part of that, right?
Part of it more than
Right.
the other parts of it, which are
Right.
just as difficult.
Right, and the emissions and the climate change portion of
Yep.
it is just, they're just two components of this overall Byzantine network of sustainability. And so when you overemphasize those things, you lose focus on the commercial and financial lens of sustainability, and not understanding that sustainability, environmental, social and economic sustainability applies across the entire life cycle of things. And I don't think the public and policymakers quite understand how things are made, where things come from, what are all the different nuances associated with that. And if they did, I really don't know if we'd be doing the things that we're doing and spending the billions of dollars that we're investing in and expanding development of things. I'm not against innovation and technologies, but it begs the question. How then, knowing if we did factor in all of these things, how can we work within our existing footprints and really leverage carbon and materials at every point throughout the life cycle? And this is really where it gets challenging, because we want economic viability for the upstream operations, right? But if the downstream operations, like if we can't recycle these things or reuse them or remanufacture them at the end of life, is it a sustainable? Are those things sustainable? Is it a sustainable industry? Are solar panels sustainable, right? If the front end of it can't be sustainable and the back end of it can't be sustainable, but the product is seen as sustainable because it's doesn't create emissions during use, then these are the expansive, challenging questions that I think we all grapple with, and how to where are the opportunities? I know there's a dearth of understanding of life cycle thinking and sustainability application in curriculum, and So Michelle focused, or she mentioned life cycle assessments, and there is not great curriculum on how to, what is a life cycle assessment, right? But it is becoming more and more mainstream, life cycle assessments, or at least talking about life cycle assessments. I mean, we're hearing about it all the time, not just in the policy space and not just in the academic space, but in negotiations and international treaties, right? And the EU Critical Materials Act requires life cycle assessment for product declarations. The UN Global Plastics Treaty is talking about that for recyclers, on making that a requirement, and it is a requirement for the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, for receiving certain energy tax credits for hydrogen. But there's not one way to do a life cycle assessment. The methodologies are all over the map. It depends on the boundaries and your assumptions. And so when that's embedded into policies and decision making without really understanding the full implications and all of the externalities in the full life cycle, it distorts people's understanding of sustainability and what we need to do and what we need to invest in.
Before I turn to the audience, let me just say, on this topic, Rachel has a great thought piece on the Baker Institute website that came out of a workshop, the first workshop on life cycle analysis that we did in January, and it's worth reading for anyone who's interested in this, how complex these things are, how difficult it is to develop good frameworks for analysis, the thinking around them, and so on. And one other quick thing before seeing what you all think about this portion. On the recycling side, and we've talked about this a ton, we have an emerging paper that's focused on metals. Rachel's done stuff, other work focused on plastics. If everybody that I talk to has one answer on all of this, is we'll just recycle. This is how we solve the problem. Try to get through the hoops on major recycling facilities in the United States or Europe. Look at the difficulties in terms of getting permittings and approvals. Look at, as Rachel said, the requirements of those industries, what it takes to actually run them, the waste that they generate, the materials that are involved, and also what you need as in feedstock, which is a huge issue. Where is it coming from? What do you have to do to aggregate it? What forms? What safety issues? What hazardous materials? Shipping issues, and all of those kinds of things. It is not an easy answer, and yet it's the one that everyone wants to raise up the flagpole, whether it's to address the standard metals, the base metals, copper, nickel, steel. We do a good job with those in terms of recapturing them. Lead acid batteries, great case study in the United States. Almost 100% of lead battery, traditional lead battery use is recycled. But when it comes to really difficult stuff, lithium, manganese, rare earth elements and oxides and all of those things, it is really, really, really difficult. And you really have to look at the expense of energy and inputs to recapture that material as part of the problem. So let's see for a few minutes what, at this point, questions people may have. And again, try to be short in phrasing the question and direct, if you don't mind. Alan.
Michelle, there's no question the last 4 months of the Trump administration has brought about a lot of thinking, both environmentally and tariff-wise, et cetera. It's been very disruptive, and I'd like to know from the panel how disruptive it's been in canceling many of the Biden area and other EPA projects that were long established and were ongoing with university systems. So I'd just like to know what the environment has changed in the last 4 or 5 months.
Do y'all want to react? We can also kick the can to the policy panel, the role of government panel later.
I can answer as an engineer. Yeah. So I had several, I'll put it that way, several projects with the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, which for people not familiar, there was an announcement at the end of last week, 24 projects for about $3.7 billion from the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, which sits in the Department of Energy. They were projects that had been awarded and were canceled. So that's pretty much unprecedented. If you had asked me last year, I would have said once money's awarded, it's a sure thing. Because the reason you don't normally see it canceled is it creates a lot of uncertainty. I was on a panel last week where when you said uncertainty, you had to agree you were going to buy everyone a round of drinks. So you can all get an extra coffee now. But there were a lot of projects that most of them were carbon capture projects. So if you had asked me a few weeks ago to talk about life cycle analysis and everything, like we had a few projects that we've done where we're all trying to figure out, for cement in particular, which there was over $1 billion of cement projects canceled last week, that you have certain emission sources that come like from the process. So the only way that you're going to really reduce the CO2 is to do carbon capture. So for that, anything that's carbon capture now is getting extra scrutiny from us on, is it actually going to go forward? Carbon capture projects were always really fun for me, but they take a lot of collaboration because like we talked about with extraction, transport, and refining, in carbon capture you have capture, transport, and utilization or sequestration. So in general, that's made everything more uncertain. People don't necessarily trust that if the government gives them money now that they're actually going to get it. That's a general sentiment I'm hearing from some of my clients, but we'll see.
Do you have anything to add?
No.
Let's kick the can to the role of government panel later, because this needs some airing beyond, I think, what Katie has offered here. So next.
Yeah, I'm interested in your comments, and you can delay these till later in the morning if you wish, on what's happened in the nickel market. A lot of investment, new mines opened up in Australia, then it appeared the Chinese poured a lot of money into Indonesia. The Australian miners all found themselves going bankrupt and closed. So a mineral that was supposed to be in short supply, better invest in it, turned out to be a bit of an economic bath for some of the Australians. Can you comment on that dynamic?
Actually, I will make a quick comment on that, and I think Katie will probably agree with me, because it actually feeds into the later discussion. What do we do about these situations? So part of this problem that we have with China is that China has been able to build scale in operations really fast and beyond what we expected and beyond what we can absolutely do. And the problem is that they can put product in the markets and drive down prices, and it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's nickel or photovoltaic materials and equipment. And that is the thing about China's economy that makes it so difficult, is that ability to achieve such huge levels, economies of scale in operations. On the mining side, when it comes to stuff like nickel, and I think this is playing out in the other metals as well, the Chinese also seem to be very willing to take positions upstream where the resource quality is not so good, putting more investment into refining and processing, intending to build large scale in order to drive down the unit cost per ton of finished metal. That's what they're doing with nickel in Indonesia and the Philippines. That's what's driving everybody in Australia out of business and making the economics of projects crazy. It's what's impacting projects here in the United States. They're doing the same thing with cobalt in Africa. So we're seeing that start rip through the markets. And I think they're doing the same thing in copper, because they will smelt lower grade copper concentrates than what our smelters will typically be willing to take. And that is tough. What do you do about that? How do you address that? We're going to definitely kick that can to Joe, especially. Kick it over to Deloitte to wrestle with.
Yeah.
They're also doing that with recycled plastics.
They're doing
too, right?
that
And so we're importing
they're
those.
doing it with,
So that
with
companies and
petrochemicals.
brands can
And
meet
guess
their-
what?
their recycled
Refined
content.
products is on the way, because
Yeah.
they are now the world's leader in refining capacity. And this is just not something that our economies and our governments are able to deal with. And
It's complicated.
it's complicated.
Yeah, I think another thing, a lot of people have a concept of OPEC. And so I've kind of told people, like, we all accept that OPEC can have an influence on price of oil, right? So if you think about China has an impact on minerals. And then you have like a lot of these things we're talking about, like nickel's a good example. When you do a nickel project, you have to look at not just how much money it takes, but the time. And for all of these minerals, part of the issue for us is our economy responds more to what's my ROI and can I get something quick? If you're doing a new mine, the answer is no. It's going to be decades. Who wants to invest? It makes it really difficult. And then when you have someone who can just put a finger on the scales and now the price isn't what your assumptions were, it does not make people want to jump on board. And so what people have to figure out is how do we get that offtake certainty? So one thing that's been interesting about a lot of projects is people have this perception of like, I want an offtake agreement and it should be for decades, right? So that's partly why people like LNG, right? You're gonna get a 10-year, 20-year contract, great. If you do something in, you know, a newer market or one that's less understood, people don't want to commit for a really long time because you can lose your shirt. So how do we kind of do something innovative on the policy, on the engineering, and then figure out like what is the best solution for short-term, mid-term, long-term? Because people can't lose money.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right, one more for this segment. Coin flip. Who's got the microphone? Ah, okay.
Oh yeah, she does too.
What's the question?
A regulatory. In mining. Okay, I'm going to kick that can to the third panel as well, if you don't mind. Because that is it. That is the third panel. So
Yeah.
please.
Speaking of assumptions, you've spoken about terrestrial mineral dependencies and sustainability and life cycle concerns. Can we expect similar dependencies and concerns to emerge in space-based extraction regimes?
Wait, like
So-
space-based as in,
You know, I've had this brain exercise.
yeah.
Do people enjoy good science fiction? Did you watch The Expanse? I love that series. And every single episode, I'd sit there and think to myself, oh my God, how would we build this stuff? It'll take every ton of stuff on Earth to just get one of these things done. I mean, so science fiction is wonderful. You can imagine all kinds of things. There are conversations about this, but I don't think any of us are really prepared to deal with it yet. But we do have, as part of Rice's heritage, the Rice-NASA relationship. And we do have, on the other side of campus, some folks who are thinking about this. And we are slowly trying to get together to have some conversations. I would put this in the general camp of frontiers. And this is a good lead-in, actually, for our armchair conversation later.
And I would say, like, for me, there are a lot more barriers to entry in that one. But we're going to talk about deep sea mining later, which will be exciting.
Yep.
And one thing, like, if I think about what's the phasing on where projects are likely to happen next, if you think about something like, okay, I've seen energy projects on the moon. I have yet to see one in the materials bucket that's been funded. I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
But if you go to something like deep sea, we have Houston actually has like a ton of subsea engineers who really understand like what's the pressure differences, how do I design for something, and then you can get that and mix it with minerals and metals people, and you can see like, okay, you could do a project, right? You're gonna have a lot of things you have to figure out, like we do with any type of project, But then when I go to the moon, I'm like, yeah, I can't help you. 'Cause, well,
Well, you know, I mean, so I gave a talk at NASA one time, and it was on circular economy and sustainability and systems level thinking. And so we had talked about, okay, what do you mean by systems? Is it just systems here on planet Earth or elsewhere? And one of the things that came up is, I mean, and in mining, it's, you know, a lot about community development and social equity. And with the folks that I was chatting with, it was, well, we don't have to deal with things like social equity and environmental justice when you're sourcing from asteroids and other things.
Oh, somebody will come up with something.
Well, I mean, because, right, like, look at the NIMBYism, the not in my backyard, and now we've got, like, the banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone, in cave, like,
not on planet
citizens
Earth,
against virtually
which
anything.
is why we talk about space rocks.
But, yeah.
All right, I want to thank both of you for stepping up here and pretending to be Ernie. For Ernie, who will, I'm sure, hugely appreciate it. Buy the book, it's a great little book. And then, you know, for exercise, you can read my flagship report. So thank you all both. Katie is going to be here, right, for the rest of the morning. There's a lot of good stuff on the Wood website, so I want to put in a plug for them, and you know where to find Rachel here at the Baker Institute. So now I need to do a switch. I need to get Justin up here, and we're going to do one little thing before we zoom in Deborah Byers. So thank you all so much. While everybody is unmiking and remiking, unless you're already mic'd, y'all can stand up and catch your breaths. But don't go far, because this is not a break. So I want to try to get us back. You'll get a longer break in a few minutes. What I want to do now is introduce the second part of the program. Yay, there's Deb. Okay, but not Deb yet. I need to go back to the slides for just a minute. Okay, we are now ready to actually tackle one of those questions that came up. What would it take to invest in the mining industry? Deb's going to have some thoughts on that in terms of what kinds of signals investors need to see and for what, and what are the considerations. And so we're going to get some input on that at this point, and then we'll come back to it when we specifically address the whether there's a role for government in all of this and what that role might be. What I wanted to do to lead into the finance side especially, and then I've got some quick images to set up Justin on all of the trade and trade-related issues that we're getting swamped with these days, is just to make a few points from an investor point of view. Somewhere in all of this, given all the considerations that we talked about in the first part of this, there is a return that I have to be able to discern. Not just a return of my capital, payback, but a return on the capital. I need a profit so that I can invest in the next thing. And that profit signal on mining, for mining, has always been an acquired taste. It's been easiest to fund exploration and development of gold because gold is a store of wealth, it's a precious metal, it's out there as an alternative to currencies and other things. It's a hedge against capital market ructions, inflation, interest rates, and other things. That's not to say that gold prices are stable. Certainly they move quite a bit. But it's a part of the mining industry that has been reasonably easy to invest in. Copper, more or less, has been sort of the same way. In fact, there are days when looking at copper and the behavior in copper markets for prices and other things, I've felt like copper is moving towards precious metal status. And we'll have to see how that works out in the future, given all of the things about it. But when you look at what's available for people to invest in, the hard thing about this, especially when we add all of the new energy technology that people feel we should be investing in, is how much money goes into the extraction of oil, gas, coal, and uranium, which swamp everything else. Everything else. And this is just physical volume. So this is just the amount of money, the roughly $8 trillion in total, of which half is just for hydrocarbons. So around $4 trillion in 2023 in value created from the sale of oil, natural gas, liquids, LNG, other things at prevailing average market prices. And you know that in the financial markets, the actual financial value, liquidity, the depth of liquidity is roughly 20 times that. You go over to one of the traded metals, copper or nickel, it's a fraction. I've provided some of the tonnages for comparison. So in contrast to the enormous tonnages, ton equivalents that we move in crude oil and natural gas, 27 million tons in copper, and it's hard to get a forward price for copper that people trust. And this is the dilemma, and it's long been the dilemma in the minerals markets and metals markets, and it's long been an issue for the capital markets in terms of finding the returns in mining and the downstream businesses in mining in particular. And this is the landscape. This is also a good reminder in that big brain burst there that out of the hydrocarbon stream comes a lot of materials that we really need to protect and continue to produce because they are the dominant materials in what we use today. Your vehicles, whether it's a legacy combustion engine or an electric vehicle, is mostly plastic, some form of plastic, with metals for the stuff that needs to be metal. And this is true of everything in life. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Plastic is very lightweight, it's durable, it's becoming better, we're advancing on composites, we're adding new materials into the mix, and all of that has allowed us to substitute from metals in order to be able to move forward with a lot of things that have been life-changing. On the trade side, this was in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago. And I thought, from just a general audience point of view, for people who never pay attention to trade and who had no idea what was going to happen post-election and starting in January, and why we're even worried about it, it's not that the United States doesn't manufacture and doesn't export. We make that point over here all the time. It's that we don't create surpluses. We create, for the most part, deficits. We buy more from others than we produce and export ourselves. The shining light, the little bright star in all of this, is mineral fuels down there in the bottom in the red box. And this has been our shale benefit. So we are exporting oil, especially light oil, that is in excess of what our refineries need and can take. We still import oil. We especially import heavy oil because that's the nature of the refining business in the United States. We export LNG. And those two things together have put us in a surplus position in trade balances on the energy front, whereas everything else is on the negative side. Negative stuff, we have all these debates over here about this, do trade deficits matter? Ultimately, they do. There are costs to trade deficits just like there are costs to tariffs. And so the dilemma is always, how do you rebalance, especially given what we talked about before, when we've got this huge, enormous trading partner with its enormous economies of scale in the form of China. How do we think about all of this stuff? And China is, it's not advancing, Daniel. Can you move it to the next slide? There we go. China is by far the single largest part of our trading deficit. Again, for all the reasons that we talked about, it's raised all sorts of sensitivities, but it's not the only place where we have issues. All of the stuff that we've been looking at here, which has become quite sensitive in the Baker Institute on Mexico, our relationships with Mexico, why we are targeting Mexico in all of this, obviously have to do with all of the other stuff, not really things, not goods, not services, but issues like immigration, security, all of those kinds of dilemmas. So now we need to bring Deborah Byers in via Zoom. And Deborah will get us going in terms of the capital market discussion. So good morning, Deborah. Thanks for joining us. And I think that everybody can see you clearly. And I'm reintroducing Justin Bowman of KPMG, who's a trade specialist, trade compliance specialist, supply chain optimization specialist. And we'll get into all the angst on the supply chain optimization side here in a minute. So Deborah, your thoughts. And I tossed some big stuff your way in preparation for this. We have endless conversations about, is globalization dead? Is it just, are we just going into a new version? What does this mean in terms of supply chains and trade? How do we think about our finances in the United States? How do we think about our ability or not to be able to finance things like the mining businesses, minerals processing, other materials businesses? So Deborah, you've had a few days to think about all of this and organize your thoughts. Go
Yeah,
ahead
no,
and
so,
snow us.
I don't know if can you hear me?
Yes. Can everybody hear Deborah?
Okay, good. It's not every conference you can come to and talk about space mining. I'd rather we were talking about that because I think the finance piece is going to be very difficult. Yeah, by the way, the person that asked about space mining and moon mining, look at helium-3. I think that's
Yeah.
the future. So, you know, it is very challenging, and there's so much to talk about, but Michelle's got me on a 10-minute clock, so I'm going to stick to it. You know, really, as I was preparing for this panel, there was just more questions that came to my mind and that I was throwing at Michelle than there are some answers. But I am going to try to kind of frame up what I think is sort of the macro issue, not talk too much about the reality of, you know, China is very dominant. I mean, think of China as a super OPEC when it comes to what they can do to prices along the full value chain and their willingness to do prices, because their motivations really are going to be very different than a company that is looking at making an investment, getting a long-term return, and, you know, really having a profit motive to return to shareholders. So I think, you know, that's a whole separate, like, all-day discussion. So what I wanted to try to do is frame up what are the big questions, maybe some different debates we ought to be having about where that capital should flow. And then looking at a lot of discussion this morning, we didn't like practice this, but some of the lessons we can learn from the shale revolution and look at business models to solve these problems, as well as maybe different areas along the supply chain that might be more attractive. So interestingly, you know, IEA just released a report this morning, Michelle. I'm sure we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive on the amount of capital that has flowed to energy. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. But big picture, mining is just a very difficult area to invest in. I mean, think about it as having all the geopolitical, regulatory, commodity risk of oil and gas, oil and gas investment. But then it's coupled with, you know, Katie said it, longer duration, you know, decades to get mine up and running to first commercial production, thinner margins with really none of the transparency or the deep liquidity, and as well as the capital markets that would allow you to make some of those investments. Now, pile on that the dominant player of China, who can pull a lot of levers and, you know, put you out of business. So it doesn't sound like an investable sector when you kind of look at it. But I think there are a lot of opportunities. I mean, let's take a look at sort of the way to maybe peel that back. First of all, I think, you know, framing this in terms of minerals, you know, think about the outcome that a lot of the minerals that will drive the materials. So the IEA report was interesting. You know, 3.3 trillion was sort of what they put out as capital flows in their report this morning, with about for energy, with 570 billion in oil and gas, and recognizing, you know, mining is sort of the investment flows is almost a rounding error in those numbers. I think it was a little bit below $70 billion. Now, so increasing investments in and capital flows into energy, but most of that is really going to renewables, batteries, grid. You know, everybody wants to invest in the grid to support AI development, for example. And then the rest of it, of course, going into hydrocarbons. Now, here's what they said about mining. Despite growing concerns about high supply concentration for critical minerals, growth investments slowed in 2024 amid lower prices, and exploration activity was flat year on year. So projects outside the main incumbent producers were just simply impacted by price uncertainty. Here's that word uncertainty. And the large integrated mining companies continue to raise their investments, but the specialist players, and I think some of those are the more critical minerals that we need to get at to secure all these other things we're going to talk about later today, have scaled back. And Canada and the United States are very marginal in terms of their increase, and it actually decreased in Australia and Latin America. So bottom line, the oversupply in China, Africa, suppressed prices, it's really made it very difficult for the major companies to justify any CapEx investment. So I step back from that analysis, and it's worth doing a deeper dive on that report and think, well, okay, there's $3 trillion plus flowing into energy, but it's going into products of renewables, batteries, grid build out. Well, all of that, 3 trillion, a lot of that is sitting on a very thin pillar of investment called minerals. And you can read Michel's report to talk about how all those minerals flow in to support the very things that this $3 trillion is flowing into. It's probably 2 trillion because let's pull out the investment in fossil fuels. So it's incredibly important that we have to raise money for mining. So there's like 3 groups. There's sort of the general capital markets, which the larger companies, the public companies can tap. Then you're left with PE groups, so private equity. There are some niche players. It's not a big pool. It's not like oil and gas, where there's still probably $500 billion of dry powder to be deployed. In private equity, it's a much smaller amount because, again, duration risk, geopolitical risk, and Michelle mentioned they're chasing returns. Well, this is a sector that needs double-digit returns because of all of the risks associated with that. It's very working capital intensive. Things take forever, and if you're a PE entity, unlike what you saw in the shale revolution, where as Katie talked about, man, you can really get things up and running, first commercial production, and there was a ready exit for that because there's a $4 trillion liquid market on the offtake side. So it's just a very much smaller pool. I think in 2023, the top 19 mining companies spent $71 billion. And so, it's not a big pool of capital, tough market to invest in. And large institutional investment pool, pension funds and otherwise that might have more longer dated outlook horizon would shy away from it for the same reason they might shy away from investments in oil and gas. So how do we crack this nut? I mean, I'm hoping there'll be some solutions that the next public panel will show, because I think this is an area where government is going to have to play and support, and not through credits or direct grants. I'm not talking about that, but through more sort of what I'll call credit guarantees, letters of credit, perhaps even outright loans, those types of programs. So hopefully we'll talk a little bit about that and how that can play in with the private sector. So what are some ideas before I wrap up this section? There was something that was put out recently that I saw that I thought was a really good idea. And it talked about getting all the G7 to pool their capital as a government to de-risk some of the investment in some of the areas, regardless of where you want to invest in the supply chain. And I think that's a great idea, but I think we need to kind of decouple that from other countries and maybe even look at it as companies, so the large players. What's interesting about mining companies is they're not very vertically integrated. And so if the choke points are in the middle of the supply chain, maybe they need to de-risk by coming together and through fairly integrated joint ventures to potentially de-risk some of the investment that needs to be made, spread that around, maybe get some support from government. So I think it's a good idea, and then you can add other countries, friendly countries, Canada, Australia, UK, that have the same objective that the US would have. Some other ideas is, I think I mentioned having the US government play here. Love to hear hear the next panel talk about that. I mean, DFC as has a mandate to support mining on the mineral side. DOE loan programs more on the downstream side. Could they get together, pool that capital? If they've canceled other projects, which I think is really not a positive thing to do, can they redirect some of that to projects that are important on the mineral side? The final thing I'll say is, we really ought to be thinking there's a big focus on the minerals. The resources are where they are. We're not going to be able to move them. But choke points and maybe even better profitability or maybe better opportunity to be innovative, especially with all the AI tools that are coming out, might be in that middle layer of the supply chain. So processing, conversion, final magnets, creating the final metal that actually will be useful in this $3 trillion of investment. Now that starts to become a more interesting investment thesis. So those are just some ideas. I will say on the trade side, Justin, as you talk about the trade side, that is a tool to help kind of protect the domestic market, not just tariffs, but just more other kind of policy, policies that provide a ring fence to allow the domestic market to make money and to develop. So those are all things that have been kicking around in my head, given the fact that, let's face it, China is dominant. They'll continue to flex that leverage that they have. Why wouldn't they? And then, but the need for these minerals and the materials they produce is going to be incredibly important for many reasons, other than just needing the minerals for themselves, but really even for the energy input. I'll stop there.
Deborah, before I turn to Justin, if you can hear me, do you have a quick thought for sort of the other piece of the capital market side, which is capital formation, and whether, I don't know if you want to go out on a limb on this, whether some of the current concerns and comments that are being raised about the U.S. fiscal deficits, trade deficits, and other things, and how those might affect bond markets, other parts of the capital market ecosystem in terms of capital formation going ahead. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that at all, or it's too early, too soon to tell? Did you catch that? Maybe not.
Oh, was that for me? I thought you said Justin.
No, that was for you. Just to see, before I turn to Justin, whether
Okay.
you want to venture some thoughts on the state of financial markets in general and how that plays to capital formation.
So capital formation, I mean, in general, $36 trillion deficit is what we have to look at. And I think that, the bond markets are kind of breaking everybody's minds right now. And, I don't really have any thought as to where that's going to go. I think the markets need some comfort that there'll be action on the deficit, that there'll be action that will bring it down, whether it's now or at least a plan that shows they're going to flatten the curve on the deficit. It's gone hockey stick. It's like the wrong area for the hockey stick to occur since really 2015, 20, and forward, and we made it worse with everything that we did post-COVID. So the bond markets are spooked. You see what's happening with treasuries, and you'll just have to see what happens with the interest rate and what the Fed does. And so it's anybody's bet, right, as to whether they'll be successful in whatever they're doing in the government right now to tame the deficit, bring it under control so that people can feel comfortable to begin to invest in areas like mining, which have a very high hurdle rate because of the risks that we've just all talked about.
Got it. So Justin, actually tariffs were supposed to be an easy way to raise money, right?
That's right.
When all of this started. I asked Justin as best he could, within the bounds of confidentiality and the proprietary nature of his practice, to share with us a little bit what the life of a KPMG trade compliance and supply chain manager is these days. What is that like?
That's a great question. So when we say trade compliance, we are a team of trade compliance professionals, over 200 of us in the United States, that are helping companies navigate and understand trade regulations that are being implemented, as well as the tariffs that are being implemented on our products. So our day-to-day jobs right now are, I've had more conversations with CEOs and CFOs over the past 3 months than I've had probably in the first 10 years of my career. Trade is a top of mind topic for everybody, and obviously the tariffs are creating conversations that in the past companies didn't need to consider tariffs. What was previously a duty-free product coming across the border now has a 10, 25, 50% tariff on it, and it's causing companies to stop and look and assess the impact of the tariff and assess opportunities, try to mitigate and lower it. So we are constantly having conversations. Every commodity, every business, every country has its own nuances. So my day-to-day is a constant learn new things every day about different markets and different businesses. And unfortunately, recently too, sometimes my answer has been, I need to look into this and get back to you, because some stuff is just being released very quickly before there's formal published guidance.
So in preparing for this, I had pitched the question to you of using tariffs as a lever to try to reshore, bring back home some of the capacity that we've lost. Of course, two big ticket items out there that have been adventures on the tariff side are steel and aluminum, and both of those have been points of contention in the mix of things in the United States. So what and I know that you've actually posted, because I saw some of the posts, on the steel and aluminum situation, and so I know you have some thoughts on these.
So we have a lot of different types of tariffs being talked about in the news. So I figured I would spend some time to just talk about the different types of tariffs, because it's different levers that our government can pull to implement tariffs, and those will help shed some light into how maybe the government's policy. But thinking back to Trump's first administration, we saw the first round of tariffs come from him back in 2018. Those were called Section 301 tariffs. And it was targeted at countries who have unfair trading practices with the United States. Keeping in mind that those tariffs are still in place, they remained in place even under the Biden administration. Now that we have the second Trump administration, we're seeing different levers. So outside of the Section 301 tariffs, we're seeing a lot of what's called Section 232 tariffs. These are focused at specific commodities that are deemed to be of interest or interest of our national defense. So these tariffs are on certain commodity bases, and this is where we're seeing the steel and aluminum tariffs. Those are specific 232 tariffs. And on the horizon, for more 232 tariffs are more specific commodity-based tariffs. They're not implemented yet, but currently under investigation. Those are copper, lumber, even critical minerals are commodities that are currently under review under this administration to implement more 232 tariffs, where our government believes there is a national defense reason to implement tariffs on these commodities. Then the other tariffs we've seen are country-based tariffs, what I call the IEEPA tariffs. These are the ones against Canada and Mexico. These were implemented under what's called the Emergency Economic Powers Act. And these tariffs are the ones that we're seeing being challenged in court right now. We're expecting to kind of have a further decision on those next week. So it's just important to keep in mind the types of tariffs and the levers that the government is pulling to implement these tariffs. There's a different reason for each one. And you can see that a certain tariff under the IEEPA, the Emergency Economic Powers Act, is being challenged, but it does not mean that another lever could be pulled to implement new tariffs against new commodity bases.
And I assume that in the practice, and as you all look at all of this, your customer base, your client base, are both either producers or suppliers of some of the affected goods and materials, but also customers.
That's right.
So the perpetual question in all of this is, if you want to use trade, in some form as a lever to try to achieve reshoring, you're affecting customers almost certainly, because the trade-off is the cost of the material, the cost of the goods, right? So do you have any thoughts, or do you detect any thoughts out there in your customer base and your audiences on these dilemmas?
I would say as businesses are planning on dilemmas and how to structure their businesses, trade compliance has to be at the forefront of a conversation. From a U.S. customs perspective, there's three simple questions that we always ask, whether it's customers, manufacturers. It's what is the product, where does it come from, and how is it valued? And those might seem like very simple questions to ask, but from a U.S. customs perspective, it's not. There's very nuanced rules of how to classify and what to call your product. There's very nuanced rules of how to determine where a product is from, and very nuanced rules of how to value your goods. We were talking about, Rachel and Katie were talking about the lawnmower example up here on stage earlier, and trying to peel back the lawnmower to determine where everything is from. I'm the guy that does that. I will look into the lawnmower and determine where each and every component of that lawnmower comes from, so that I can help determine the proper country of origin for that. We do this for all commodity types, such as
So you can actually answer the perpetual questions on our Galaxies and iPhones
Exactly.
and everything else? Okay,
and
that's good to know.
When we talk about space mining, I've never looked into that, but these are the same questions that we'll have to ask from a customs perspective. So we'd love to have that conversation with you once it actually happens.
Right.
But we're having these conversations every day with helping customers understand this, because if you know how to classify your product, or you know its origin, or you understand its value, there's ways to mitigate opportunities, to product engineer or tariff engineer what you might think is a product of China just because it's symboled in a China. From U.S. customs perspective, that might not necessarily be true, and that's why we have to pull back these layers and understand where everything comes from in order to get the right answer.
So I want you to unpack that a little bit. I like that phrase, tariff engineering. We've got financial engineering over on the other side. We know that. And let me ask that if Melissa and Meow Meow are in the room, let's see what questions for this portion there might be while you tell us what on earth tariff engineering actually is, and how do you do that and be in compliance legally in general, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's...
There are creative ways, and trade compliance is, used to just be one person sitting in a room navigating through customs regulations. Now it is a group of engineers, procurement, tax, legal, and myself all coming together to say, how can we mitigate and engineer this product? Best example I could give most recently was, working with a PV solar manufacturer. They manufacture their solar panels in China, completely from China. From a customs perspective, though, opportunity to potentially change that from being a non-Chinese solar panel to a panel of another country. So we looked into, the supply chain of the panels. Where can they get the solar cell wafers from? Where can the solar cells themselves be manufactured? And then can final assembly of that module still remain in China? And with that, we were able to help determine if you were to get solar cells from Germany, utilizing wafers from Malaysia, finally assembled in China, you actually have a product of Germany, because the origin of a solar module is really dependent on the solar cell and where it's manufactured.
Whew, okay, but in looking at some of this that has been in the public domain, I mean, ultimately you could still have a question of whether the manufacturer involved or the corporate entity involved in some part of that supply chain was from one of the places you might be targeting, either Chinese or another country of concern.
There's always another factor. We have so many government agencies with their hand in different regulations, and that's why trade compliance is just so important to be part of your planning conversations outside of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. We have Department of Commerce regulations, we have OFAC regulations and sanctions, and all of these other agencies who have regulations of who we can deal with, who we can transact with, what we can import, and what sort of licenses or permits are needed to have commodities. So there's always multiple aspects outside of your tariff engineering from other government agency regulation standpoint you must consider. Which is why trade compliance is just absolutely a top of mind conversation for all businesses and all planning at this point in time.
Great. There's a couple of questions I know. Okay, go ahead.
With the tariffs, is there any way that is going to make the deficit go down by collecting tariffs? Because aren't we as consumers in the U.S. going to end up paying the tariff?
For the deficit part, I'll say I'll leave that one to an economist.
Okay,
but ultimately the tariffs, that is true, are paid by from a customs perspective, it is paid by the U.S. importer of record. So it's the company in the United States that's buying that product pays that tariff to U.S. Customs. Now do they either absorb that tariff cost or do they pass it on to the consumer? That's a business decision, but in the cases where they would pass it off, ultimately the end consumer in the United States could be paying it.
Okay, so that just says that basically, if it's passed on, we as a consumer pay it.
That's correct.
And we're moving the money from our income as an individual to the government. So it's a tax.
So I think the thing to differentiate is the price effect, but there are fees and duties that get paid that are part of the imposition of tariffs, correct?
Yep, tariffs are a form of customs duties that generally applied against the value of a good. So if you import an item that's $1,000 and it has a 10% tariff, then your duty payment would be $100 for that. So that's why it's important to keep eye on the value and how you're valuing your goods in order to ensure that, if possible, lower that value from a customs perspective and therefore lower the amount of duties being paid.
I want to see if Deb heard the question and has a reaction, since that is kind of the question of the day in terms of what is currently in play. Any thoughts on that question? Whether the tariffs actually have a deficit reduction benefit?
That's for me, Michelle?
But yes, I just want to see if you have a reaction. I think we're probably having some Zoom problems
I'm
here.
sorry,
So that's okay. All right, there was another question. Somebody had a microphone already, or?
Yes, over here.
Oh,
Over here.
okay.
Yes. Hello. Good morning. My question is with regards to the process of tariff engineering. When it comes to customs, it seems like there are particular conditions as to what qualifies as the product being from any given country. And so I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit more of a summary as to how customs determines those conditions, and if there's any particular sort of policy or lobbying by institutions or companies for particularly, wanting their product to be considered from any given country.
So I will say, from a U.S. customs perspective, we have the most complex rules of determining what is a country of origin and where a product is from. And the term that U.S. Customs follows is that a product must be substantially transformed through a manufacturing process. And there's a certain test that U.S. Customs applies in order to determine if there is a substantial transformation. So it is a subjective test, which does require companies, trade compliance professionals, to review every step of the manufacturing process. It's the reason that I am breaking apart this lawnmower and understanding where every part and piece comes from in order to perform this review. Unfortunately, it is not there is no scripted rules to follow. It is a case-by-case basis on products that's reviewed, and we are one of the only countries in the world who follow this rule and regulation. Most other countries do have what's called a tariff shift-based country of origin rule, but here it's called the substantial transformation analysis.
Next.
Over here. Do we have an actual example of the effect of tariffs and reshoring a product or industry? I mean, whether, you know, the first Trump term through Biden or the latest cycle of tariffs. Do we have an actual example of having an impact on reshoring anything?
I will say the majority of my conversations with customers are are assessing manufacturing operations elsewhere. And from my perspective, I see a lot of manufacturing in Southeast Asia, utilizing Chinese components and helping customers understand would that product be a product of China, even though they use Chinese components and assemble them in an outside country. So I generally, it's just helping assess manufacturing operations elsewhere.
I can offer one that I've been watching.
I was going to offer one.
Okay, go ahead.
No, I was going to just offer that, you know, don't just focus on the dollar tariffs themselves, but also other sort of trade barriers, if you will. So
Sure.
in the CHIPS
Non-tariff.
Act, non-tariff barrier. And so the CHIPS Act actually has resulted in at least announced and now producing factories, you know, the TCMC factory in Arizona, I believe it is. So there are some examples of reshoring, and it's just going to take some time. And some of it just really came about organically because of you know, the recognition that there are these choke points or single points of failure in supply chains that we saw at COVID. And so there was sort of a natural organic move to sort of diversify supplies, bring them closer to shore, near shore, friend shore. And so I do think that this now uncertainty about where tariffs are going or non-tariff barriers may pop up, whether it's this Trump administration or the next administration. So there is a movement towards capital. A lot of people are talking about that, especially on the manufacturing.
And I think, yes, to be clear, I mean, we've been doing things, other policy initiatives. This will come up in the later panel on the role of the public sector as well, that pre-existed all of what has unfolded since this administration came into office. What I was going to say specifically, pre-Trump administration, so in the Biden administration, one of the loan agreements through the Department of Energy program is to try to stimulate an additional aluminum smelter being based in the United States. Now, this by itself, this is controversial, this project. When I was back to the circular part of the conversation, when I was in graduate school back in the 70s and 80s, we had 30 operating aluminum smelters. We had aluminum smelting in Texas. We got down to, roughly 5 or so. We are down to sort of what people refer to as 2.5, depending on which day it is, the half smelter, whether it can operate or not. The company that is operating that smelter has said pretty consistently that they plan to decommission it. There's numerous problems, that the cost structure, the age, and everything else. The loan agreement was issued to try to build a, quote, green aluminum smelter in the United States. It would have to be somewhere, most likely in the Mississippi River Valley, because it needs hydro in order to meet the targets that are in the loan. All of that was kind of struggling along. The aluminum tariff has kind of given new life to that particular project. But when you look at this stuff, you know, the important thing in all of this is, are these projects the right things? I mean, this is ultimately the question. Is this a viable project? Is this the right thing to do? You know, do we really want to reinstate that capacity, or do we want to do something else? And this is the question that I keep pushing on. What are the considerations that we have? Okay, time for one more. I think that was, yes, go ahead, please.
So, good morning. No worries. Good morning, and this was a great tee up, and I want to build on a statement that Deborah raised earlier. My name is Brandy. I actually own a metal recycling company. We're processing aluminum,
We've
brass,
had
copper.
email exchanges.
Yes, yes. And so my question was, Deborah had talked about there being opportunity in the middle market. And I wanted to explore that a little bit further because of the challenges that you just shared, Michelle, where there's a lot of resistance and pushback to having mills and foundries in communities, if you will, but that is what's needed in order to produce more here. I'm handling copper, you know, we have it melted down, we send it downstream, but there's a lot that goes into that. So I'm curious what the middle market opportunities are that Deborah alluded to.
Okay, that's a great question, Brandy, and I'm going to ask that we defer that because there are some specific things we'll be talking about later that deal with these dilemmas, and I know you've been trying, so go ahead, real fast.
Just a quick question on the tariff engineering. Sure. Once you've got a tariff regime established, and you've characterized your product as saying, okay, this product is from Germany, even though it's assembled in China because of the wafers coming from Germany. Okay, you've done that, you've established that with customs. Now you say, okay, tariff regime has changed because a new tariff has just been put on Germany and tariffs to China have dropped. Can you recharacterize your product now and say, hey, no, this is really Chinese after all?
We are seeing companies do that every day, and as long as there is compliance support to make that change in the supply chain and make that declaration change to U.S. Customs, that's what we're helping ensure companies are positioned for. If the supply chain allows for those changes, there's opportunities for those to change.
Hey,
All right.
Michelle, on deficit, I mean, we need to kind of get the tariffs will help the deficit, I think, out of our heads because, you know, historically it's been less than 2% of the federal revenue. And I just don't think you're going to end up in a situation where you're going to increase that appreciably. So it should just be decoupled from thinking about that as a way to fight the deficit.
Since I know that most of us are in positions in our lives in which the deficit matters ultimately in terms of quality of life and lifestyle in retirement, finances, I invite you all to continue that part of the discussion over coffee. You now have your official break. I need everyone back in the room at 10:15, please. Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Deborah. Really good. Excellent stuff. This is something that we're going to have. All right. New ventures. New ventures. Space mining, frontiers, startups, big time. All right, so in planning the event today, I put out several feelers because around here we've had lots of people show up with lots of ideas. You all may know this, Houston is full of people who have direct lithium extraction ideas, so DLE is like the new big thing because Texas is blessed with brines, so everyone's trying to figure out how to do something with that resource. And then we have a variety of things going on, part of which will get covered by Kristen on that magical midstream part, the thing that's so tough to do, processing and refining. There are various projects and there have been some announcements on bringing capacity into Texas for certain things. So we mentioned the rare earths. There's 2 or 3 different rare earth related efforts. There's even an idea to, this one's not so popular, but to breathe new life into the old Asarco copper smelter in El Paso, things like that. As I said, in Houston, we used to have a metals business. We had what we used to call, in the old days, oil country goods. Do y'all remember that? We fabricated, we made stuff. We made drill pipe. My God, we haven't made drill pipe in I don't know how long now. So the question is, you know, looking at us and looking at the Gulf Coast, how do we play in all of this? Because Texas is not a traditional mining state. I will tell you though, we are the #1 mining state. In the latest USGS report for the United States, but why do you think that is? Why do you think Texas would be bigger than, say, Nevada or Arizona? No, this is minerals commodities now. No, come on, what do we do a lot of? Well, okay, but I'm talking about the physical stuff. Why would Texas be such a huge state in terms of USGS data on mining and extraction. Sand, frack sand, for crying out loud. Come on, you guys, y'all are slow. Sand, gravel, I mean, what do we do in Texas? We build a lot of stuff, right? Especially roads. So we are usually like number 2, but somehow in the 2024 report that just came out, we're number 1. So there you are. But even more interesting, so as we've been working on all of this stuff, one of the things, of course, about Houston and about the Gulf Coast is what Katie brought up. This is an offshore industry place, and it's always been a highly valued part of our industry base, our culture, the fabric of communities on the Gulf Coast where people have, for decades, serviced the industry, staffed the industry, helped the industry become specialized. I did a tour of duty years ago for Simmons & Company International. Y'all know the Simmons family, Matt and Ellie Simmons. Ellie is still heavily involved here with the Baker Institute. We spent that entire year, this was a bad year, 1989-90, we were retiring a lot of stuff, but the amount of technology advance in practice. In those days, a lot of stuff was getting invented and commercialized for geopositioning, for all of our modern state-of-the-art drill ships, for improving topsides for offshore facilities, for figuring out new ways of being able to complete and manage offshore oil and gas production. So it turns out that when you walk over to Kristen's part of the world, and this idea of marine minerals and deep sea mining, we have a lot of kit. And there are some startups in town that are peers of the metals company, Ocean Minerals being one. They've actually been here with us on campus for programs. We did a roundtable on the prospects for deep sea mining. I did an offshore technology conference panel. There's a robust part of the offshore community that is thinking about this. How do we do it? How do we make it work? How do we make it safe? How do we protect the environment? How do we protect people? How do we capture this resource? And what we're going to talk about over the next few minutes are some ideas along those lines, and especially that resource. And so I'm introducing Kristen Hingstebeck, who I've had, gosh, I can't even think about the number of emails and virtual communications and other things, and it's such a pleasure and privilege to have you here in person with us. Kristen and her group have been incredibly forthcoming with data and research, not theirs necessarily, but in the world of marine minerals, which is actually not new, right? I mean, we've been messing around with this since, I would say...
Since everything else you're talking about.
Yeah, 50s or 60s, I think, or probably when
Right.
some of the first USGS circulars came out, out in the Pacific Research Division of USGS for the minerals research groups. That is kind of the heart for everything that the USGS has been learning about the marine minerals base. And just to kind of kick off the discussion for Kristen to delve into, a map that is a commonly used map of the world, and just to think about what we know. Now, you know, we always talk about what's been explored, what's not been explored, and one of the things we know is that very little of the oceans really have been explored. And I forget, there used to be a percentage, Art, maybe you remember this. What portion of the oceans have been explored? 5%, 10%? 1 to 2? Okay, that's an official earth science opinion right there. So that's about as good as they get, too, I can tell you from the household side. And so across this huge bit of real estate, there's a lot of stuff. And in fact, one of the things that we don't think enough about when it comes to the oceans and what goes on in the oceans is how that affects everything else that we think we understand, like gas exchanges between oceans and atmosphere and other things that will kind of get controversial quite fast. All I want to say to kind of finish this discussion off and turn it over to Kristen, that little image up there, which unfortunately ended up being kind of small, that's a pebble field. Something magical that I don't even think earth scientists understand very well, or physicists or chemists really. The ocean water column, as we know, we talk about gold in the ocean all the time. We talk about lithium in the ocean, right? Really, really small concentrations. But somehow, with depth and water temperature and other things, those metals, those elements, come together into nodules. And all of the imagery that's available, you can Google this, it's all over the place, on all of the research websites. When we look at especially these big blue blobs all over the place, they look like this. They're basically fields of polymetallic nodules that are nearly 100% metal.
That's right, and I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Texas at the onset of this discussion and the commodity summaries from USGS. In the context of sand and other metals, we do a lot of nearshore mining. So we do a lot of mining in shallow waters where we do have a pretty robust impact on the ecosystem, whereas nodules are found about 2.5 miles deep on the abyssal plains of the seafloor. And so that type of ecosystem covers more than half of our global ocean. And what you're seeing on this map is the blue areas, which are nodule dominant, but there are other types of deep sea minerals as well. So there's seafloor massive sulfides, as well as cobalt crusts. And those are actually sitting attached to things like underwater ridges, for example. So they're attached substrate to the ocean floor, whereas nodules sit unattached. And it's unique in that they kind of aggregate metals from the seawater around pieces of sand, bone, other things that have kind of bottom filtered down to that level of the ocean. And so from that perspective, they're a two-dimensional resource. We can see them, so you're seeing one of those images here. And the metals company is squarely focused on nodules for a couple of reasons, one of which is the sheer abundance of nodules, both globally, but mainly in this area kind of in between Mexico and Hawaii that you see on the map called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. So it's a fracture zone. I would say by and large most of the exploration of the deep ocean in international waters has been focused on. And that's really since the 60s and 70s, as you pointed out. So we've known about this since the 19th century. Some explorers found this by dragging buckets essentially across the ocean floor. So technically we've been able to get at them since then. And really the focus has been on developing the technology to minimize our impact to the seafloor and optimize collection efficiency of those rocks. So this just to say there are many different resource types in the ocean as there is on land, and deep sea mining is not just one thing, though it's sometimes easier to kind of push it all into one bucket. And so why the focus in the CCZ in that particular fracture zone? The amount of nickel, cobalt, and manganese contained in those rocks dwarfs that of all land-based reserves combined.
And let me add something here. I have a really close colleague who's just exited off ARPA-E. So for those of you who know the DOE Advanced Research Program for Energy, who was building inside ARPA-E a focus on DSM. This has been looked at independently. This is not a metals company opinion. I just want to share that because oftentimes people look at this and of course the perception is you're advocating for the business.
Right.
Well, you are advocating for the business, but this has been vetted and looked at, has been peer reviewed heavily, and tests are what they are.
And so this is actually USGS data. So as you mentioned, the Pacific office did a lot of work on this area in the 70s and 80s, as did Commerce within NOAA. And so, you know, what you're seeing here is just the pure abundance of material, why folks are focused on this. These are 3 US critical minerals. They also contain copper, which depending on the list that you're looking at is critical. And I would just note for manganese in particular, we're 100% import reliant in the US. We haven't produced domestically manganese since the 70s. And it's a key ingredient, of course, in steel making, as are nickel and cobalt. But essentially, the US is the #1 importer of silico-manganese alloys that go into steel making, which is something that nodules can completely support if we're to reshore and be able to domestically process nodules. So essentially, it represents this generational supply of at least 4 US critical minerals that currently has no commercial activity, and we'll get into why that is. If you look at nickel and cobalt on this slide, you'll see some of the countries mentioned earlier, so folks did a great job of setting this whole proposition up. You can see on land, Nickel is dominated by growth in Indonesia. Cobalt is dominated by growth in the DRC, both of which have very strong holds with China, whether that be on the mining side or the processing side. And so if you look below those two countries, you'll see Australia, which was mentioned earlier as one of our key trading partners that has closed many of these mines and refining facilities based on the activity of Chinese players in the market. So not a great, I like to bring solutions to some of these conversations, so you set up the issues well, and I think that this resource in particular, based on its quality and abundance, can actually rival land-based supply chains of these critical minerals.
All right, so what are you guys doing?
Yeah,
here's the fun part.
So the metals company, we've been working on these projects since 2011.
I think this is a little better than dragging a bucket on the seafloor,
It
right?
is, and so, you mentioned at the onset U.S. companies, and particularly Texas being at the front end of this, so a lot of U.S. companies in the 70s developed the technology to collect nodules that spans Kennecott, Lockheed Martin, Shell, BP, U.S. Steel, and so a lot of not just the collection technology, but also the monitoring tech, so autonomous and remotely operated vehicles, robotics, a lot of which had their start in the U.S. So it's strikingly similar as to like solar and battery technologies that have started here and haven't necessarily stayed here. And so the metals company has been working with our offshore partner, Allseas. They're a Dutch deep ocean pipelaying and construction company that's been working on this type of system really in the oil and gas industry since about 40 years now. And they have helped us design the collector robot to actually do the seafloor collection. And then they've also purchased on our behalf an ultra deep water drill ship, so again repurposing oil and gas assets to become the first nodule collection vessel. So we have that. We've done test mining as recently as 2022. And so I just wanted to show a couple of videos of what this looks like. You will see kind of a rendering at first, and then an actual nodule field in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. And again, we're about 4,500 meters down. You can see they lay unattached to the seafloor. We actually use a jet of water to shoot at the nodule and suck it up into this robotic collector. And so the impact profile of that is about a couple of centimeters, so 3 centimeters is what we interact with. And I would contrast that between work in the 70s and the more dredging type of technology that they would use was about 80 centimeters of sediment that was disturbed. So a lot of the technology around this has been how do we minimize interaction, minimize any kicked up sediment or mud at the seafloor, and then how do we optimize where we're actually taking that mining vehicle and increase the efficiency with which we collect those rocks. So if you look at something like this, much of the abyssal floor, which is 50% of our global ocean floor, looks like this. It may or may not have nodules, and it may or may not have the abundance of nodules that the CCZ does. And so that's kind of close up what the seafloor operation looks like. And then this video is our test mining system out in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone in 2022. So you see the mining production vessel at top, and then this robotic seafloor collector being lowered down. In our commercial operation, this would have a pair to it, so we'd have 2 of those robotic collectors, but by and large, this will be the same system that we use for future commercial operations. And a test like this really hadn't been done since the 70s. So within 50 years, we were the first to bring up nodules at this volume to the surface and lifted the largest volume of nodules ever collected, which was about 3,000 tons. So super exciting for the team. You can see it coming up in the centrifuge there on the vessel, and then nodules shaking out. They're really more potato-sized rocks, and they break up kind of in the riser system as they come up to the surface. So extremely microporous, fragile, doesn't require any additional beneficiation on land. And as Michelle mentioned, the entire nodule mass can be used. So in some of the earlier panels, you talked about waste as an issue. So maybe for every finished ton of copper that you produce, you have 500 tons of waste. We don't have any waste. So we're able to use the entire nodule. So we have nickel, cobalt, copper, and manganese. We'd also produce like a road aggregate material and then some fertilizer as well. So from 500 tons or so per ton to 0, a pretty good metric. And then we'll see later some of the GHG emissions components to that as well. the unique thing about processing them is they're very similar to nickel laterites that you'd find on land. So for example, in Indonesia. So you can use similar technology to process them, which means we can use existing infrastructure to do that, at least at first pass. So speaking about Indonesia, we know there's been kind of this explosion of nickel mining over the last 15 years or so, and that's really been based on, one, the grade that's left there, right? We've depleted, and I think we had a slide on this, but basically the global average ore grade of nickel and copper has depleted so much over the last hundreds of years, whereas there is some good grade left in Indonesia. It just happens to be located very thinly across giant swaths of rainforest. And so essentially what's happened is that industry has exploded maybe 14x over the last 10 years. And so China's been a big part of that. They banned the export of nickel ore from Indonesia officially back in 2020. And so there's been a ton of Chinese investment in mining and processing in the country. And then of course China does its own nickel and cobalt and manganese processing beyond that. So the fact is there's a lot of stranded, what we call rotary kiln electric furnace processing capacity outside of Indonesia that relied on that ore, some of which is located in Japan. And so what you'll see in this video is our commercial scale trials taking about 2,000 tons of those nodules. Oops. We'll go back. One more.
Let's see.
See if it goes.
There we go.
He's got it for me. So this is one of their 3 RKEF lines. They used about 2,000 tons to test essentially the operating conditions of using their existing plant to process nodules. And they did that successfully first in the calcining, which is removing the moisture content from the nodules and then smelting it, like very similar that you would do to laterites, and producing a manganese silicate, which essentially is an input for silicomanganese alloys used in steel making, and then also making a nickel cobalt copper alloy. So that intermediate could be refined, for example, in Japan, in South Korea, or in the US. We just have to build the infrastructure to do so. So this is very much, I would contrast, we sometimes our group with asteroid or space mining, this is something that's very much the technology is available, it's relatively low risk, it's used operationally across the globe today. And really it's the feedstock that's different and allows us to, one, produce no waste. We also produce no tailings. So there's no deleterious elements in nodules like you might find in land-based ores. So we don't have the storage that goes along with that, a lot of the waste storage and inherent risks that come with not only having that to manage, but also putting that near human communities. So you can see there's no fixed infrastructure at the mine site that we have to contend with. We can choose where we process the material, and so that gives some interesting questions as to the customs and tariffs that would be associated with this. But essentially, it just provides an entirely new alternative supply chain for 4 U.S. critical minerals.
And before we leave the processing thought, so can you just share some of the ideas about processing in Texas?
Yes, so since really 2019, we've been looking at where would be the best locations, to do our processing. So we started with a global outlook, where is the political stability, access to inexpensive power and consumables. And some of those sites were revealed in the US. And since then, obviously based on a lot of dynamics, including geopolitics, but also us being a US listed company, we've looked at sites in the US, particularly the Gulf Coast comes to the top because we need access to deep water ports with pretty significant capacity available to us. And then we need large areas of industrial land. So that kind of paired with power costs, access to the consumables that we need, that whole ecosystem centers around Texas. And so in 2022, we submitted a site to the Defense Production Act program on supporting additional engineering work to go into that facility, which included a smelting operation, which at the time was a difficult lift, I think, to get permitted in the US. So we've actually updated that to be just the refinery component. But essentially, this year's National Defense Authorization Act authorized funding for such a study, looking at the feasibility for specifically nodule intermediate refining. So it's something that we're squarely focused on, and we're honing different sites within kind of the Texas Gulf Coast of where that could be.
And obviously, we will help you as much as we can.
Definitely.
All right, there are a lot of questions around all of this, right?
Yes, lots of questions. And I guess before we jump into, and I'll hop around here, we talked at the onset about, GHG emissions being just one component of environmental impact. Benchmark Mineral Intelligence did this study that looked at if we were to source nickel, cobalt, copper from nodules instead of land-based benchmark ores and the processing methodologies used therein, what does the actual footprint look like? And so what you're seeing here is particularly for nickel, what would, in the bars, the associated global warming potential be from doing that? On the left, you'll see Indonesian laterites, right, kind of double pyro processing that's done there with about 100 tons of carbon per finished ton of product. And then at the right, you'll see nodules. So the lowest GHG impact, but also the lowest in terms of water use, fine particulate matter generation, all of the other more nuanced things that not necessarily everybody looks at when they're looking at resource evaluation. So from that perspective, it's environmental. On the social side, right, we're 2.5 miles down in the ocean. There are no human communities. We don't have kind of the associated labor and kind of human impact profile sets that we do on land with land-based mining, particularly for cobalt, I would mention, but also for Indonesia, right? Indigenous peoples don't have really a category there. There are no, I would say, continuous air or water quality monitoring that's done or required by the country. And so it begs the question, what do we actually know about our impacts on land? And where have we imported or exported those impacts based on not wanting to do this in the United States? So even in the case where we do have some of the metals, we don't do this because of these impacts. So this graphic does not capture any of the social aspects of this, but essentially they are not to be, discounted.
Let me say quickly, for my colleagues here, Jean-May, Rachel, others of us who have been so diligently trying to understand life cycle analysis, the benchmark life cycle analysis is something we should look at. I've looked at it a couple of times. I was looking at it again yesterday. This is really, really good work for all of the things that we worry about, data sources, boundary conditions, all of that sort of thing, all of the UN metrics and so on, using international standards for life cycle analysis. So that's point number one about this. Point number two, to the point about laterites and what's going on there and the comments I made about nickel, we produced a report on Indonesia, nickel production in Indonesia, what was happening. I think that was about 2 years ago. It's been one of the most circulated things I've ever done in my life, actually. This is not a small thing. There are a host of issues. For those of you who know something about aluminum and the aluminum value chain, bauxite and bauxite extraction, any iron-rich, iron ores that are occurrences like this, the amount of what we call red mud all over the world. I have a very good friend at MIT who I think is dedicating his life to trying to figure out how to recycle that. These are enormous problems for the amount of material that you get, the scale, the effects, and so on. So it's not small change.
Yeah, and I think you have to just say, we're maybe blindly just willing to accept these impacts, right? We don't import the finished product from this mine in Indonesia in the US, right? It goes to Japan, it goes to the Philippines, it goes to China.
Into the batteries, and it shows up here.
It goes into batteries, and when we talked about, the US demand for these materials, if you look at the USGS data, it only looks at the raw material. So if we're importing EVs, battery components, or precursors, that's not captured in what the US uses. And so that kind of gets at these Section 232 investigations is, it's not just if it comes from China, it matters if it's substantially sourced from other countries with effective control by China, which would be a lot of Indonesian operations. So it's a big picture issue.
It's a big picture issue.
With not easy solutions.
Now,
Yeah.
one thing, though, to the previous slide, socially, you have a big social cluster to deal with, which is the United Nations,
Right.
because you guys are in that portion of the ocean real estate called the area, which is not us, the United States. It's not one of the economic zones of other nations. Other of the deep sea mining companies are in other places like Cook Islands, Marshall, and so on.
Yeah, so to that end, the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, it's in international waters, so anything beyond 200 nautical miles from the coastline is considered the area. And so this has quite a colored history, starting from really the same time frame. So in the 70s, when the US started developing this industry, it predated any of the UN governance of this area. So the national legislation in the US is the Deep Seabed Hard Minerals Resources Act, which is a mouthful. We can call it the Act. It was adopted in 1980, which predates the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea or the International Seabed Authority. So they were already operating really as a freedom of the high seas, which all nations enjoy, very similar to navigation, to fishing, to overflight, marine research. And so they've continued to operate under that since. They've never ratified the Law of the Sea, and they've never become a member of the International Seabed Authority. So this was always a question, I guess, as a US listed company that came to us, right? So shouldn't they ratify the Law of the Sea? Shouldn't they become a member, right? We're the only maybe major world power, even though there's 30 plus countries that haven't ratified the Law of the Sea, that aren't a member. And as a company, we were like, we're agnostic, right? Not our place. We're not the State Department. We're not foreign relations on the Senate. So that had really only been posed, as recently as 2012 on ratifying the Law of the Sea, which again failed. And so I think through the 14 years that we've engaged with the International Seabed Authority through our sponsoring states, which is a very, in theory, holistic part of the Law of the Sea, is that for every developing nation, or every developed nation that had access to these minerals, because they're located in international waters, developing nations would have the same rights. So we're actually sponsored by small Pacific Island nations, that being Nauru and Tonga, to do our work within the ISA. So we've had those contracts since 2011 and 2012. And since then, we've operated within that international regulatory framework. We've done all the legal requirements around getting to a commercial stage of operation, and for many years the ISA has kind of kicked the can down the road on adopting the mining code. So they missed their first legal deadline to do that in 2020. They missed another deadline in 2023, and then they're set to adopt the code this year, which we anticipate that they will also miss. So they've been in breach of their obligations of the Law of the Sea, and kind of during that time, in the video that you saw on test mining, it is the Western parties that currently have the technological advance on China in this space. So China has really they're doing their seafloor collection testing this year. We've done the full integrated testing as of 2022. The Belgians are also ahead of them. They've worked with the Germans on that. So Japan has done that testing already. So they're in a different position than they are on land in the deep sea. They've done other things in their own national waters that aren't regulated by the ISA, but essentially they've been very happy to take that gap in not having commercial activity and try to catch up. Mm-hmm. So this is really what I think has worried the administration for quite some time, and part of what really pushed this executive order.
Which we do have, and actually is quite well written, I have to say.
Yeah, it's pretty comprehensive. And so the idea being there that, the US, just because the legislation was adopted in 1980 doesn't mean that it's not valid. Mm-hmm. NOAA actually issued 4 exploration licenses in the 80s for US consortia underneath that legislation. It notified the UN of that in 1986, to which nothing happened. So you could say there's precedent for this. And then the US has also had bilateral and multilateral agreements outside of the ISA really throughout the 80s and 90s, with almost every country that has an exploration license for nodules under the ISA. So legally, this is not something new. It's just something that is refreshed, I think, in interest. So that executive order that was issued at the end of April, it directed Commerce, which is the regulatory kind of department, and specifically NOAA, to expedite the review and issuance of exploration and commercial recovery permits in the area. And then it also tasks Defense and Energy to look at, should the US be looking at an offtake or a stockpile of this material in order to keep China from getting it into its own hands. So it does a lot of other things in terms of authority of funding as well, but it really is kind of an ode to taking back some of the leadership in this space that the US originally had in the 80s and 90s.
One way to look at it, which I've thought about when it was first issued, is that it may be that it actually leads to things. I mean, as a direct result of the EO. The other thing is that it could be a prod to the UN, it could be a prod to the ISA, and force them to recognize that what their responsibility is to deal with this.
I think so. I think it's definitely challenged them. I think, there was a recent House Natural Resources hearing on this topic, and one of the minority witnesses was asked, well, doesn't, a US unilateral move encourage China to do its own thing? And it was kind of an interesting response in that they're already well positioned within the ISA. So they have a lot of influence, they have the most exploration licenses, so it behooves them to actually kind of emerge to the top as this multilateralism.
They also have a sphere of interest, a geopolitical sphere of interest.
Right, and so they're well positioned there, and so they're happy to say, like, how dare the US do this? But they've also breached the law of the sea in many instances with really no comeuppance, right? So it kind of begs the question, like, are they fit as a regulator? Do they have any weight? And they've already really discouraged a lot of private sector investment by missing all of these deadlines. So what it's created is kind of this state-owned enterprise advantage to which China has many. So it's really this geopolitically charged space that then there's also a lot of environmental noise around, and that's what this slide is all about. So within the ISA, there's member states, there's 168 of them, plus the European Union. And then there's observers, of which the United States is one. We also have about 100 environmental organizations that are observers as our contractors. So we basically have the same status, which creates a lot of issues in terms of proceedings where you would like to see a certain issue addressed by the council within the ISA, and then by filibustering or inviting others to speak, we just happen to not get to them. So that's kind of what has happened to Nauru in our case. And so they've been basically ignored by some of the international community in driving this forward, which led TMC to really focus on the US regulatory pathway this year. So we've put in 2 applications for exploration licenses with NOAA as of April, which are in substantial completion, and then 1 commercial recovery permit as well. And so there's real concerted effort to evaluate and then review and potentially approve those applications, which has been relatively refreshing given our other experiences. So a lot of the noise, because we have no human communities, there is no light, there's very little food at this part of the ocean. 70% of the biological activity is bacterial. So we really don't have as much to look at in the deep sea as we do on land. But there have been plenty of speculative comments about what the impacts could be. And so NOAA back in the 80s and 90s, they did 7 reports to Congress on this topic. They did their own programmatic environmental impact study across the CCZ. And they basically found that all kind of catastrophic scale impacts were debunked. They did not find any. And the things that they were looking at were test mining at higher scales or larger scales, and what the sediment plume impacts were, and what were those impacts to what we call benthic communities in that part of the ocean. And so these 6 kind of impact areas in red are really what our environmental impact program has focused on. And all of them have basically nulled concerns around this. And you would never know that by Googling this topic. So you put in deep sea mining and it shows you dolphins and sunlight and plumes, like atomic bombs going off. And so at that same hearing, Dr. Thomas Peacock from MIT, who's been studying sediment plumes for about a decade, at the end they asked him, if you could be asked a question at this hearing that wasn't asked, what would it be? And he basically said, is the data that's been found being taken into account in decision making? And his response was definitely not. So he, even just as a scientist, is frustrated because we know the answers to these questions. So oftentimes, even in very well-respected publications, it will say we don't know enough, right? But we do. We have, just as TMC, a petabyte of data on this. We know that $2 billion has been spent on research. There's been over 300 campaigns to the area looking at this specific topic. So sediment plumes, I mean, things like that will reach Hawaii, right? We're gonna touch Hawaii with the sediment that's kicked up. It rises about 2 meters above the seafloor and falls back down because it's very high pressure. It behaves much more like a liquid than a gas at that part of the ocean. Similar kind of metrics around midwater plumes. So maybe hundreds of kilometers, not all the way to Hawaii. Noise and light, so lots of different modeling gone on there. Most of the noise is from the surface vessel, so not unlike any single ship that's located in the ocean. As far as light, again, mostly surface. We don't technically need light at the bottom seafloor collection to do the collection piece. Carbon sequestration you mentioned. So this is a big one that, you know, we just don't know what's going to happen. Maybe we create this whole new source of carbon that the planet has to deal with. I would say less than 5% of oceanic carbon is actually in any of the sediment. And then for the CCZ and abyssal plains, less than 0.2% of that is contained. In addition to that, as I mentioned, we're rising 2 meters above the seafloor, not 4,500 meters. And there's no injection pump mechanism for that sediment or carbon to get to the surface. So we know the answers to these questions, but it's very easy to drive people in a different direction. Biodiversity loss, this is one where people say, well, we just don't know what's down there, right? We know maybe 20% or so of the species have been identified on the seafloor. And so if you hear that, like, that sounds bad. But that's over a couple of decades. We know exactly the same amount of species on land. About 80% are unknown. And so that's over 250 years of data that's been collected on land. So in a vacuum, some of this data is very misrepresented without context. In the same way, say that half of the CCZ were mined tomorrow. How much of the seafloor would actually be impacted? It's 175 times less than we impact every year with trawling, right? So it's a very small portion of the ocean, maybe less than 0.2% would actually be mined, even if 50%, which is not economic, goes forward. So it's a lot of nuance that takes a little bit to get to, but if people are willing to invest the time to think about it and really use data to assess it, it does come up as really a key opportunity. There's others that have come up. These new impact areas come up before International Seabed Authority meetings each year. This year, or really last year, it was dark oxygen production. So maybe we're producing oxygen around nodules, and this is some new, very novel thing that we have to investigate and spend money and really devote real research dollars to. We've known for decades that it's really an oxygen sink, right? So as electrochemist by training, I find this one particularly offensive. There's not the necessary voltage in the water at the time. There is no light. So there's no way that we're splitting water magically at the bottom of the seafloor. Same thing for radioactivity that came up in years prior. There's more radioactivity in your granite countertop than in nodules. And so there's this whole framing of narrative, and it's really, right, it's the deep ocean. People think there is no industrial activity at the bottom of the seafloor, but that's not true, right? We have seafloor communication cables that carry most of the world's internet traffic. There's microplastics at this point, and then we're doing a lot of this more impactful mining near shore or on land where you can tell what the impact profile is comparatively. So really, it's been the regulatory piece that has gated this, along with this kind of environmental activism that's really distracted people from the real science on it. So we have a whole lot of material on these concerns.
And you will make it available because
Yeah.
they are very generous on that front. In fact, all of the companies are, I have to say. What I want to do is open the floor to a couple of questions, but I'm also going to ask Joe and Gabe and Ken, if y'all are here, in order to try to stay on time, maybe y'all could get mic'd up while we're doing this. And then, I'm sorry, you already are? Okay. That's your mic up there. Oh, got it. Okay. Gabe and Ken, if y'all are around, maybe we could go ahead and get that done so we can stay on time. Yep.
It's interesting, and it may be a real solution to a lot of problems, but where besides Japan did you say you were thinking about doing your smelting?
Yeah, on the smelting side, there's a whole ton of this infrastructure in Indonesia. It's really been overbuilt there. Some by the Chinese and some by completely Indonesian parties. There's also been Korean investments in the country. So Indonesia has the most smelting infrastructure. I would say next would be China, and then there's smaller capacities in Japan, South Korea, and other countries. We would like to reshore all of that to the United States. So as mentioned, there's no nickel smelters here today, but essentially—
Where in the U.S.?
In Texas.
And is it really zero emissions, or is this another let's treat Texas like a third world country?
Zero emissions in terms of the processing facility? No. So there will be an emissions inventory associated with it. One of the reasons, right, like to build this type of smelter in Canada, for example, versus Indonesia is much more expensive because we have sulfur dioxide.
How would
to
you get a
contend
bunch
with.
of heavy ore into Texas? Because on
Oh.
your map, there's none of it in the Gulf.
So we, from the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, would go through the Panama Canal. So we intend to use Panamax scale vessels for that. And that's why we needed such a large capacity deep water port.
I need to give someone else the chance here. Barbara? And if a mic could come up to Art, and I don't know who else. Oh, okay. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I got a couple of questions over here.
Short questions.
So you've talked a lot about the economics, but cost of supply relative to land methods, and then scale up potential. How much would you be able to, you've got one small exploration operation now. Can it be material, and how fast would that be?
Yeah, definitely. So the question on timing. So we talked about like time is money on this. So we have the first pilot system that you saw. We just need to add one robotic collector, and that's it. We have PAMCO in Japan doing their trials now, so they're ready to accept up to 3 million tons of material when we do have commercial approval to mine. So the time to market is actually, especially in terminology of mines, very small. And then on the market impact, right, so maybe say that first, we call it Project Zero, but that operation does maybe 30,000 tons of nickel per year. So if you put that in perspective, if we were able to process that in the United States, it'd be one of the largest sources of refined nickel on the planet. So it's pretty significant, right? And so that's why we think there's economic benefit to operating out of the CCZ with nodules, but you have to have the right abundance, and then you have to have this additional low capital strategy to get into the market, which has been what we've been pursuing.
Cost-wise, what I'll say is, from the data that's been shared with me, it's competitive. Because there are offsetting considerations in terms of the additional processing and handling costs. It's a different kind of resource. Another quick question. I guess it's y'all two back there, or Jim?
Yes, thank you for a very well illustrated talk. And are the videos available on your website or anything?
Oh, you can Google them. They're YouTube-based, Vimeo-based.
That's some of the best stuff I've seen. And I think in regard to the earlier discussions on full cycle economics and impacts, some of these examples where biology or the laterites that Michelle mentioned that are going to have less processing tailings and debris are,
No, more on the laterites.
Oh, yeah. But less than a porphyry, probably.
we're talking really, really low concentrations.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And a great deal of gang that has to be dealt with.
But that's, looking at the full cycle impacts, is attractive. So I think that's.
We also have to, and bear in mind too, one of the
thinking.
issues that we were going to bring up is quality. So the form, the chemistry of the nickel and the laterites as opposed to the nodules, and what that means in terms of handling, processing, and other things, which is part of the life cycle analysis from Benchmark, and something that we looked at when we were looking at the introduction of high pressure acid leaching in Indonesia. It's a significant consideration. Barbara.
Thank you.
And then I'm sorry, but I have to close up. So
Okay.
you're going to be.
I'll try to do this. Great presentation. One of the things with value chains is, are there all the other pieces of the value chain available, the service companies, the contractors? Your sense, and I know OTC has covered this area and stuff, is there enough of an ecosystem to support companies like yours, which is a small company trying to do the whole thing, so that you're going to be able to specialize in part of the value chain and make this happen?
Definitely. So we've done, especially on the onshore processing piece, the ability to get the equipment and the consumables domestically is definitely there. There are, I would say, drill ship operators that are American, like Transocean is here. They have a similar agreement.
Transocean, by the way, is in a joint venture with Ocean Minerals, so that's actually something that we've covered.
Yeah, and so offshore there is that ability, right? We don't build those ships in the United States, and that's something that obviously the administration is working on as well. So that could change, but essentially under US permitting, we'd have to be using US flagged vessels, right? And that material has to come back to the US. So the question is, at what point in the value chain? So if we were to produce these nickel and cobalt sulfates here today, we'd still have to export them to Japan or South Korea to make the precursors. And that's really where, on the battery side, there's this middle of the supply chain disconnect that we can solve for, right? We just don't have the feedstock to really care to do it yet. Same thing in steel supply chains, right? We don't make manganese alloys here because we don't have manganese, right? We have cheap power. We could be competitive in it, but we don't. So this really would start to solve that, right? If you build it, they will come. And so this type of facility, just the downstream impact would be immense.
We have these problems in spades with the land-based projects, Twin Metals in Minnesota, the cobalt operation in Idaho, where we just don't have the support. We don't have the value chain support, and it's a huge problem. And today, anyway, just as a summary comment on the earlier conversations, if you mine in the United States, for the most part, you're sending your concentrates abroad. That is life in the mining industry in the United States.
That's right. Yeah,
so
but I think it's not that we technologically can't do it, and it's certainly not that we don't have the capital, right? It's the time, the upstream industry that we need, and then the political will to do it, which I think is there.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate
really
it.
appreciate it. All right, so if we can do a quick personnel change and get the last panel on the stage to wrap up. All right, so, well, since Ken was here all of the time, that's really good, not having to go in and out. You heard everything that ended up at the end of the program that has to be resolved in 45 minutes or so. So what I want to do is start with Joe, because we've talked a lot over the years, getting recently reconnected on all of this. And it happens that on the Deloitte side, you all have rolled out some ideas. And so I'm curious, what I think you could do to kick this off is tell people kind of what you all were thinking. And then from what you've heard today, are you going to go back and change some of those 13 action items? This is the Deloitte report, which is online and available publicly. And to me, this is funny. It's 13 actions. I have 9 challenges. So there you are. We're all in odd numbers.
Indeed.
There it is. Oops.
All right, well, first introduce myself really quick, and thank you for having me. My name is Joe Figueiredo. I'm a senior manager at Deloitte. I have worked in the U.S. government and on behalf of the U.S. government for about 15 years, mostly in the energy and critical minerals sector. This includes a lot of interagency battles, and so I know that world pretty well. And also, I actually cut my teeth doing the shale gas revolution stuff. So I actually spent a lot of time in the States, in Texas, working at the state, local, regulator level, and so have a good sense of that. So just wanted to give you some quick background. I was trying to think of how to best capture how the government is perceiving this challenge, and I had two thoughts. So one of them was thinking about, I think it was John Dillinger that said, we just have to rob one bank, but FBI has to watch all the banks. And I think it has the wrong connotation for bank robbers being sort of industry, but I think it actually still fits a little bit. And then it works the other way as well, as the bank robber saying, which bank do we hit that has the most value, and how do we do that? And then the other movie I was thinking of was, Everything, Always, Everywhere, All at Once.
Yeah.
And this is all just to say that the government's overwhelmed, and they're taking some really great steps to try to address the challenges in the critical mineral space. And what we've done at Deloitte is we've worked in this space for a while as a firm, and internationally over the last several years, I've led a lot of projects myself. And so what we did is we tried to find action items that ended up being 13. It could have been 20. It could have been whatever. But we wanted to think of, and Michelle asked me to come with realistic ideas. And we think they're realistic, but they're short and medium term. But we came up with some action items that I'll talk about some of them. But mainly we're looking to help the government achieve sort of 3 goals. So one is increasing domestic mining sector, the renaissance of the domestic mining sector. 2, sort of continue to look internationally to obtain those minerals that we can't feasibly in the short term develop here domestically. And then 3, help mitigate market risk. And so the 13 action items fit within those 3 sort of goals that we've set. Before I talk about that, though, I wanted to just highlight 3 sort of areas that I believe are necessary, like preconditions for a government strategy to accomplish these goals and to really tap into these action items that we identified. And the first, it was great, Kristen ended on this saying, it's political will, clear leadership, and a sustained focus. Now, I think that what we have now is that in many ways. I'm not sure about the sustained focus, though. That concerns me a bit because, executive orders can be rescinded, and the next administration can. We've seen what this administration did, and so an executive order is really helpful and good to push the country in a certain direction and push the government. But how sustainable is it, and how do we get to that certainty that industry and others are looking for, which we've talked a little bit about today. Also, thinking about the Defense Production Act, the funding that the executive order is calling to be used to help grow the U.S. domestic mining sector, that's great. But when that funding runs out, Congress has to approve more funding, and that means working with Congress. And so there is a role here for Congress to get that last piece, that sustained approach and policy approach that needs to be considered and thought of. And I really like the national energy dominance, that approach. Maybe that could be sort of that leadership and that clear direction. But it's going to be a monumental effort. And frankly, I'm not sure how they're going to be able to pull it off, because governments for the last decade at least have tried to do something similar with mixed results. The second, we talked a little bit about this, sort of identifying and agreeing on the highest risk critical minerals and supply chain segments, just to make it more complicated, that we need to maintain our national security and to help feed our industry and our commercial growth. And this is, you were talking earlier, Michelle, about sort of coming to terms with what we're looking for, where we're looking for whom, And then I think you had sustainably, how to do it sustainably in there too. These are all really important questions that we haven't come to terms with yet. And the multiple lists sort of show that. And I thought Katie mentioned the 13 overlapping minerals. Maybe that's somewhere to sort of focus a bit. And as I go through some of the action items, I want you to have these in mind as sort of necessities, because the questions would be like, well, what about how when you say targeted, what do you mean? This is what I mean: targeting on the most critical, the most at risk minerals, both upstream and midstream processing, and then how they get to the manufacturing. And then the last piece, actually wrote down during something you said, was not just solving current problems, but pushing innovation to solve the problem of tomorrow. What if we lock down all the lithium we need, and then lithium becomes less important in the future? That's not a good example, but it's sort of, or maybe we find a DLE, it becomes much more economically feasible, and it's no longer an issue. And so when you're thinking about solutions, trying to think of sort of what are those areas that we can innovate. And I'm not going to go into how we do R&D in this country, because it's a really challenging issue that I don't know. I don't have any.
Ken will.
For.
I'm going to tee him up for
That's
that.
Great, and I love that. And I thought I was going to be up here by myself, and then I remembered Gabe was here, and I remembered Ken was here, so I'm very excited for that. And so anyway, so those are sort of precursors, and I'll go through these pretty quick, just so that we can have more discussion. So the first goal of the U.S. government is to increase domestic mining sector, to grow it. And we've talked a lot about that today. And I think the first thing that needs to happen is the federal government has to facilitate closer coordination between, first of all, interagency people working on these issues. Now, you'll hear people say, oh, there's a capacity deficit in the government of people that understand the mining sector. And in one way, you're absolutely right, but in another way, you're absolutely wrong. The problem is that they're dispersed throughout different parts of the interagency. And so, you have experts in the Department of Defense that people in Department of State have never heard of and don't know. I mean, that's not entirely true, and I don't want to put my friends in government.
It's an example.
It's an example, but there are people at Commerce that work on these issues, looking at suppliers and looking at sort of getting the value of the goods and where they're coming from, that Justin was talking about a little bit. But they don't always work together, and it's something that I think needs to happen. But that's actually not the point I'm trying to make. Working closer with state governments and with local officials, when you think about permitting process, when you think about environment and social impacts, this is something that it's going to be a top-down, bottom-up process, and there's the inclination to just make it a top-down. We're going to fast-track these Fast 41 projects that they're going to get done, so make it happen. They're on a website where they're transparent in the timelines and all that. And I think that's a great initiative, but from the bottom up, working with governments at the state and local level to help facilitate conversations with communities and to help improve their role in the permitting and approval process is really, really important. And I have a good example of this, which people in this room might be familiar with, which is the IOGCC role, the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission, during the shale gas boom. And I worked with them, and the biggest thing that they did is they brought industry to the table, industry from their states that had these conversations, that wanted to move these projects forward. And so it was a collaborative approach to move projects forward, mostly on private land, which I think might be the case with the mining sector as well. But then you always have to deal with the federal government, whether it's NEPA or other regulations and policies. So that's one area, so closer coordination. Looking at data, which hasn't been mentioned that much here, even though we included it in all these graphics, and everything you do is data driven. And this is going to come up in the international sort of component as well, which is looking at what mineral resource actually is. And I'm a big proponent of using AI to sort of figure out, sort of get a better sense of maybe what's underneath the earth. But it's not, you have to dig to find it. And you have to go back and look at old geological reports. We have wonderful geological surveys in the States, and the USGS is phenomenal. But presenting that data to companies and targeting these critical minerals that we need that companies investing in and developing in, if we could establish a high quality standardized approach to sharing this data, that may cut down on some early exploration costs and may drive some interest in investments in areas that we need development for these critical minerals. And then the third part on the domestic side would be continuing and increasing the domestic financial measures that we've talked a little bit about today already. And this includes, I believe, re-looking at the conditions for getting this funding. And they're so onerous and cumbersome.
So for like federal lending, you mean, grant programs, loans, and that sort of thing?
Exactly what I mean. And so sort of, I know companies are asking to keep some of the IRA measures like X30. The Export-Import Bank has a Made in America program. You know, DOD, OSC, and DPA sort of being directed to fund projects in the states. I think these are all great initiatives. They just need to be focused effectively and continued and in a way that people don't think the rug's going to be pulled out from under them when it happens. The other thing I'll say really quick is that these funding opportunities tend to be the government's very receptive to ideas, but they're not really going on the offense. And so one of the things I think would be helpful is for having some of these government agencies being more proactive, using some data perhaps that they have, and knowing what critical minerals we're all on board for, and then going out and saying, hey, these are the things we need to be doing, and by the way, we have these programs that can help you. And then on the internet, this is also going to be on the international, the next one, which is having them collaborate together to get things done, which I hadn't written here. I think it's in the report, but I think that's a really important point, and especially on the international side, which I'm more familiar with. Sort of combining DFC, Export-Import Bank, and maybe DOD, OSC funding to go in. I'm sorry for using too many acronyms. Office of Strategic Capital at DOD, it's a couple years old. Gabe, maybe you can talk about it, maybe not. But it's just a new arm of sort of capital that the government can put towards.
So, but are you suggesting better coordination among all of the different international financing arms, or putting them under one roof? Not so much as, not as dramatic as that.
Sure, but I mean, I don't want to act like nothing's happening already. Things are in motion for those sort of combination of efforts to happen. I mean, I don't want to sound like it's because of this Deloitte report, because it's not.
Right.
But I'm just saying these are good ideas, and these are things that they should continue to push forward on. So I think, actually going forward on sort of to the international development side. So that's sort of the domestic side. Going on international, I think we need to continue to leverage some existing mechanisms that we have. The Mineral Security Partnership Project, which is looking at working with our partners to target specific projects and get them over that last little hump. I think that's something that should continue and maybe even become a little more robust. I know you and I have talked about picking winners and losers or targeting a little bit better. I know, but it's something that we need to think about when our national security is at stake. And then looking at like Minvest is another one, public-private partnerships out of State Department. None of these have really flexed their muscles, like MSP maybe, but tapping into some of these tools and sort of getting them actually going in a coordinated manner. I mean, empowering DFC and Export-Import Bank. DFC has been asked to do domestic work as well, so that could have been on my domestic sort of action item. But looking at the Export-Import Bank, the Supply Chain Resiliency Initiative. So what these two in particular, DFC and XM through the SCRI, they can make equity investments in projects in other countries. And they've done that in different sectors, but not as much in mining. There's TechMet, which they did, I think, in Brazil, and they're starting to do more, and they're talking about doing more. And so the ability to do equity investments, I think, is important. And I know, sovereign wealth fund and all that sort of stuff, we can talk about that, but really using the tools we already have. And then as part of this, and I'm a little biased here because I spent a lot of my career doing technical assistance work with 50 plus countries on shale gas work, on mining sector work, on energy sector, power sector work, it has to have a technical assistance component. It doesn't need to be huge and robust, but we need to be able to train up and work with counterparts that know and understand leading practices for regulations and how to manage a project effectively, because these projects need certainty when they're going into these environments, and that could help de-risk some of those environments they're going into. I already mentioned the data thing. One of the things I did want to mention, assessing tailings and waste. For most companies, tailings and waste are a problem they don't want to deal with. But with the need for gallium and germanium and some other trace metals, there could be potential in these waste piles and these tailings dams. And how do you incentivize a company who's already spent all their money doing other things to say, oh, now you can look into this, and by the way, it's going to be dirty, it's going to be a lot of work, it's going to be more expensive for a lower valued commodity. And so basically, again, maybe looking in and finding that data and showing them, hey, there's potential here, this is the grade level that we did in our initial assessment, and doing that through either collaborations with them, through DFC or another funding arm from the government. These are low-cost activities that could have really high rewards and create opportunities for the private sector, including U.S. companies. And the one you wanted to talk about, I know I've maybe gone on too long a bit here.
Yeah,
but
we need to just do one.
Mitigate market risk. So how do we balance government efforts with market-based approaches?
Yeah, I think that's given a lot of the conversation today, that is such a key thing. Going into an investment, building your projections, looking at what you estimate you will have in value and returns. But you can get completely undermined by a project coming on board, which is a problem in lumpy industries anyway. But we have got this new reality of just, again, the enormous scales from China. Well, how do you insulate?
Right, and I don't have an answer.
No,
thanks
I
to
know
Deb
you
for
don't.
saying I had one maybe. But I do think that this type of collaboration, mineral security partnership, government guarantees or some version of that. I don't want to.
But we have exposure here too. I mean, we've got efforts that people have been trying to launch, but because of deterioration in the price environment for the commodities, just knowing what's out there in inventory.
Protecting them from the carpet being pulled out, essentially, from China.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think I'll stop there, but those are, so the last thing I'll say, and actually would be good for Gabe here, would be looking at the national defense stockpiling efforts. My thinking on this is, the amount of minerals that the DoD needs is relatively small, but that doesn't mean that they can't work together with industry, that maybe they can help them develop their own stockpiling efforts and collaborate together, which is another thing I think Katie might have mentioned or someone mentioned. And so really rethinking how we're using that stockpile and how it's working with sort of the industries we need to get what we need for our defense, but then also sort of helping them get their stockpile and protect their minerals for commercial development. So sorry I went too long. But
No, not at all. So leaning into then the opening from Joe on the defense side, and Gabe and I have talked a ton about priority materials and mechanisms, and Deborah kind of laid the groundwork on that by talking about offtake agreements. So, what contractual things could be done to try to address some of that if you look at the defense ecosystem itself.
I think where you start with that is you think about the metals and materials that you need to fight and win a war, and things that are much more military specific. Like, to kind of go through the spectrum, you look at something like steel or copper. Those are critical for a war-fighting enterprise, but DoD is a tiny portion of not just global demand, just U.S. demand. It's 1 or 2%. It's the same thing with semiconductors and things like that. If you start getting into things like titanium and tungsten, cobalt and some of the things that go into jet engine superalloys and those types of materials, it's much higher. Those are also probably the things, to your point, Joe, that you're more likely to want to stockpile. I'm biased because I was trained at a hedge fund and as a lawyer. Contracts are awesome. I think so much of the time when we're thinking about governmental policy incentives, it comes to subsidies, to loans, to things like that. What's really magical about a contract is you can unlock more private dollars. I mean, what I'm always looking for when I think about it is how do we get a 1 to 10 or a 1 to 15? Because that's something that makes it scalable, that makes it sustainable. And frankly, when you look at our current federal budget environment, it's also something that's more fiscally realistic, and it's probably going to be easier to get bipartisan buy-in. And to just kind of make this concrete, you think about, for instance, some of the cobalt. I think there's at least one big cobalt project in Idaho that keeps getting put on ice as commodity prices swing. Who's to say if that's a good enough deposit that you don't anchor it with a contract to refill national defense stockpiles?
So that's precisely my question.
Yeah.
Can you do that? A long-term offtake agreement, have a DOD guaranteeing basically the delivery. DOD is simply anchoring the deal and anchoring the project. Somebody else is going to take the material and move it through the supply chain and help smooth out cycles. I mean, is that a viable thing? I mean, you're exposing the taxpayers at that point to the shifting market conditions.
Sure you are, but I mean, if you end up being short of some sort of critical material when there's a real fight with the Chinese or whoever else, I'd argue you're exposing the taxpayers orders of magnitudes more. So my short answer is yes. And I mean, not to be flippant, but I think with some of these structuring things, where there's a will, there's a way. And especially when you think about how important some of these things are. Like, I would liken them to industrial vitamins. Like, your body only needs a tiny, tiny amount of, vitamin D or vitamin B12 or something, but if you go without it for very long, you're in big trouble. These are the same kind of thing, but I think what the flip side of that is, sort of the tiny amount and the high importance, is you have more latitude for working with the economics than you do with a bulk commodity like oil or natural gas or copper or steel or something like that. So I think to distill it, the answer would be yes. We just have to be more creative about how we come at this.
Mm-hmm. Just to give everybody a quick feel for the range of conversations out there, there are discussions about everything from providing price floors, which is really tough to think about, to favored loans and lending treatments, which are also kind of difficult to talk about because of that financial metrics problem. The contract offtake guarantee sort of idea. Other than that, people start drifting off into specific government intervention in various things, and even taking positions. Now, we sort of have had that idea in terms of, can we look at federal real estate and bring federal real estate into the picture somehow? So,
do you want me to elaborate on what we mean by federal real estate? This isn't DOGE going and taking a nice office in downtown DC or something like that. What we're actually talking about, or Michelle, I don't know if you fully agree, but when I talk about minerals processing, I'm thinking of some of the most environmentally impaired federal real estate. I'm thinking about Hanford, Oak Ridge, parts of Los Alamos, parts of the nuclear complex where, if you think about siting a plant for processing cobalt or rare earths or something like that, if we talked about doing it on the edge of Houston, people might really react badly. They're like, we don't want all these lanthanide metals and other things. But if it's a site that already has plutonium and has dealt with uranium enrichment or something like that, some of these defense-relevant metals we're talking about actually look pretty benign in comparison. And so it's something where it's all relative. And I think the reason why this idea is potentially worth considering is you think about how time kills deals by introducing risk to financiers and others. Time and litigation are very closely correlated. If you have something where you can start with impaired land, maybe have some sort of federal indemnity or something else, and you can roll forward more quickly with the project, that can potentially help you better manage some of that financial risk. I'm sure there's different complications, and I'll probably get some hate mail afterward, but that's the general idea.
In talking so we produced a report, Geoeconomics of Materials for Security. It's on the website. And talking with various people about that, I have had some pushback, and Joe may have a comment on this, and Ken may as well, that you may not actually be alleviating the cycle time, because you need the U.S. government, anybody operating on U.S. government land or any dedicated facility that would get turned over, you still have to go through and do all the check the boxes and comply and ensure that all the environmental protections and public interest protections are there. And so some of the pushback is that you're actually not alleviating burdens, but at least you're taking care of the locational problem, perhaps. So
what if you're working under emergency powers?
If you're working under emergency powers,
I think if we're being completely blunt about this, this whole checklist of things is a lot more accordion-like and flexible than you might think. I mean, I think sometimes we have, this idea of laws, this completely, rigid, diamond hard set in stone, but there's an enormous amount of malleability, particularly if there's political prioritization from the very top. And in when this is framed in the context of a geostrategic competition that's existential to the future of the United States, I think that changes the conversation pretty significantly.
So Ken, pulling this into like a big picture, given all the stuff that's been talked about, supply chains, trade, the macroeconomic situation and context and all of that, and thinking about this desire for innovation as a breakthrough.
So I didn't actually know what I was going to say when the day started. Literally, I was tasked with just listen. And I come back to something that I actually teach, which is kind of interesting. It's really understanding how supply chain resilience intersects with all of this discussion. And I'll go through basically 6 points. Sometimes these are separated into 7, but they're pretty straightforward. And I'm going to give you the added benefit of connecting it to effectively what the public sector can do, so what the government can do. And what you're going to see, it is a whole of government type of discussion. It's not just about a single department. So the first one is inventory management, and a lot of times when we talk about inventory management from the way governments approach this, we get into strategic stocks, right? So you go back to the oil embargo of the early 1970s, one of the things the US government did is step into the creation of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. That was a supply chain resilience reaction, right? And this is not unique to the SPR. You're going to see in everything that I say going forward, there are historical points of reference that you can draw on. So we don't need to recreate the wheel, right? That's what a lot of people need to, I think, fundamentally understand. Next one is diversification of suppliers and off-takers. So this is really about developing a deep liquid market. If you do that, you actually de-risk a lot of the investments that would flow into it, because you get adequate interest on both sides of the supply chain that actually give you a nice price signal that tells you when to do whatever you need to do. This ultimately, from the role of government, steps into international investment, free trade, and domestic investment. So all of the things that we've been talking about. Free trade was a pillar that the US government really pushed forward on for many, many decades. It's not so much the case now. International investment, where you get into diversification of suppliers. You don't need to make everything here. You just don't. But you can't rush through to an end game by relying on a single source either. We learned that in the oil market in the 1970s. It's remarkable we're sitting here repeating history, but that's what we're doing. What you need to do is actually incentivize in whatever way possible by reducing barriers to investment is probably what I would say would be the most efficient way to do it. Investment in resource development all over the world, not just domestically. For those of you who don't know, and I'll lean in on oil again because there's just a long history of oil and quite frankly a lot of lessons that apply to all of this discussion. US oil production prior to the shale revolution peaked in 1972 and it started to decline. And this, of course, raised all sorts of concerns about supply security and economic and national security. But the one thing that you have to realize is that we stopped producing as much oil domestically, not because we were out, but because it was cheaper to buy oil from other places. It's really that simple.
Choice. There it is again.
Yeah, choice, right? One of the things that happened in the wake of the Arab oil embargo was there was a significant amount of interest due to a price signal, but also sufficient government incentive to dive into new frontiers. So you get into places like the North Sea, right? As that started to manifest, and it took years because these things don't happen in 2 to 3 years. They take 5 to 7 to 8 to 9, right? It's a long time horizon with large, very capital intensive endeavors. But when that started to come online, what did you see as we rolled into the early 1980s? You saw OPEC really stick to its guns and try to keep production offline to keep price up. What they ended up doing in the face of declining prices is sacrificing market share to new production. And once the genie's out of the bottle, it's out. And the whole world changed radically. So again, thinking about ways to promote investment everywhere around the world is critical for this particular endeavor, diversification of supply and offtake. The next one is technology adoption and process innovation for operational efficiency. This gets into R&D. It's really that simple. There's way too much focus, in my mind, in governments around the world on deployment. There needs to be a lot more and heavily renewed focus, much like there was in the 1980s, quite frankly, rather than on deployment on R&D. There's a really phenomenal example at NREL, right, up in Colorado, where you drive onto the lands and you actually can see that it's like a standing museum, the history of solar panel development, right? It's remarkable, right? Well, there was a lot of really cool stuff that was going on there and still going on there, right? But unfortunately, in real dollar terms, we've actually seen domestic R&D expenditures decline from the federal government. A lot of that is shifted into the private sector, but if the government's going to have a role in this, they need to change that course because it's not efficient. The next one is strong counterparty relationships. Again, we're just talking about supply chain resilience. How does the US government get involved there? Diplomacy. Literally that simple. So the US State Department has had a massive role on this front. The creation of the Department of Energy and Natural Resources, which is being dissolved, was really aimed entirely at promoting US energy interests around the world. It was a pure diplomatic effort because the State Department can't make deals. That's not what it's about when it comes to energy. That is a commercial endeavor, but it can certainly pave the way for deals to be done. So, basic question comes up, why are we dissolving that department? I have no idea.
Joe might know.
No idea.
Does Joe know? He won't say, that's no comment, right?
It's a no comment.
I mean, yeah.
We can talk after.
Yeah, absolutely. Deep transportation networks and logistic management tools. So this is about port expansion and emphasis on reducing constraints on both domestic and international commerce. So obviously, this is going to touch almost every department in the US government, right? But it's critical that we reduce impediments to doing deals. It's literally that simple. And this isn't just about permitting. This isn't just about a trade deal. This is actually a whole of government, whole of value chain discussion. You can't focus on one part of the value chain and expect things to happen.
That's right.
And unfortunately, that happens way too often in public policy. You need to focus on all of it, because if you don't, you'll end up with coordination failure at some point in that supply chain and things will grind to a halt. It is incredibly important that you take a whole value chain approach to really deepen those transportation networks and logistics management tools. The last one is understanding risk. And this is where it takes study and engagement with industry along the entire value chain. A lot of times this gets castigated, and this has been true on both sides of the aisle, when industry has a very vocal role in trying to create policy, it's criticized, right? It's often viewed as kowtowing, but you know what that actually is? Yes, it's self-serving, but it's also about deepening supply chains. It literally is, that's all it is. And again, I'll use oil. Today, if you go back to 1970 and compare the oil market today versus the oil market in 1970, by the way, this is why oil is not going anywhere anytime soon, by the way, what I'm about to tell you, okay? It is the deepest commodity market on the planet. Most well-developed supply chains, most sophisticated logistics functions, massive amounts of inventory, massive amounts of trading opportunities, very liquid networks. Think about everything I just said. It's got the most commodity-based supply chain resilience of any market on the planet. It's literally that simple. It is robust to risk. When we talk about this particular space, what we should be focused on is making this market look like that. Because if it does, we're not having this conversation anymore.
At least for certain things, but that's the focus problem, because building the depth of liquidity for oil for some of the more exotic materials is more difficult, and they may need different treatment. But for the base metals, for instance, the key alloy ingredients, things like that, it could be possible.
But look, I mean, you don't need every metal.
You don't need every metal
to be that way.
That's right.
I mean, we actually trade petroleum product derivatives based on like for jet fuel. There's no real liquid market for jet.
That's right.
Right, it's traded against a derivative. So these things are possible as long as you actually steer the market in the correct direction.
Yep. Yes. All right. All of this from you all was really eloquent. We're over scheduled, but my inclination is to take 10 minutes and see what closing thoughts and questions from the audience we have. If that's okay with everyone. All right. So a hand in the back where we haven't had a microphone, and let's see if we can do this efficiently. Thanks, Meow Meow. And thanks, Laura and Meow Meow and Melissa, wherever Melissa is, for doing all the running around with the microphones. Really appreciate that.
I think you need to click it on.
Okay. Very good. Thank you so much. This is a wonderful program today. Thank you, Dr. Foss, and all the other panelists.
It's nice to see you, by the way.
Yes, likewise. Thank you. So this we've talked about a lot of generalities with regards to the international markets in the U.S. So pardon me as I ask for a little bit more of specifics. Both Joe and Ken have mentioned the sometimes turbidity of U.S. policy waters, at least more currently than before. So my question has to do with how the current U.S. foreign policy can support or hinder mineral trade with African nations, especially considering China's strong foothold in African mineral extraction. How can the U.S. build competitive, ethical, and strategic alternatives? Thank you.
Excellent question. Let me throw in my 2 cents, and then you guys can wrestle with it. I was a USAID contractor for 13 years, and a lot of quality time spent with great friends that I made in Africa, east, west, and south on different projects. The difficult problem, so back to your comment about we need some technical assistance. The dilemma we have, that we've always had, and this is 50, 60, 75 years old, we engage in foreign assistance, we engage in technical assistance, and we get caught in the 2-year election cycle in Congress. We get caught in the appropriation cycle. Everybody wants immediate results, immediate metrics. The forms we had to fill out on USAID contracts for the results that we thought we could achieve in a country. How do you report back to Congress on something that's actually a generation? Before you finally have enough training, capacity building, knowledge, project management. I was really glad that you brought that up, because that was what we thought in the end of all of that was the biggest impediment across the board. It didn't matter whether it was Africa, Mexico, South Asia, wherever we were, former Soviet Union. This was the biggest problem. The discipline that comes with managing projects that have to perform, that are subject to market changes and pressures, and being able to execute. And that's hard to gain.
And how do you quantify it?
And how do you quantify
You're like,
that?
oh yeah, we taught
my reporting form was like, okay, how many people showed up at your workshops and how many were men, women, or whatever. What does that tell you? I mean, that doesn't tell you really anything.
But I think there is something to, I mean, I agree with everything you just said, but I think there's something to, well, those are 2 questions actually, because one of the questions is about the current administration and its approach to things. And, we're 5 months in, 6 months in,
It's early.
It's early, and so I don't know where they're going to go with things. I think there's a resetting going on, but so I don't really want to touch that. But what I will say is that the type of technical assistance work that I am talking about and thinking about is more about creating a framework for investment, training the managers in the regulatory agencies that are often engineers, not that the engineers are bad, or geologists, but they don't understand the contractual side of things or even the political side of things, and they just get pulled back and forth by an industry that's asking them, they want to invest and develop this project, and they're smart engineers, and they say, yeah, you can do that. And then they have lawyers and government officials above them saying, oh, no, you got to do something different. We got to have, carve out for different payments here and there. And so the work that I've done over the last probably my whole career is helping governments sort of identify ways of creating the framework that will bring in more certainty into the process, reasonable policies in place based on international leading practices. And so that creates the conditions for for proper investment, which includes ESG measures and those sort of things. And the last point on this is that if a country doesn't incorporate leading ESG policies into their legislation, their policies, regulation, then a company, even if it's on their webpage saying we follow all these policies, if they go into that country, they don't need to follow that, even though they say they do, and that's their standard. They're going to follow the standard of that country. Yep. And so going into a country, and I've spent a lot of time in Africa, and saying, you got to put these very clearly in place, not to create an impediment. And so we always definitely make sure we try to find that balance. But if a country doesn't have that, it can't just assume a well-known company who has a good public profile is going to come in and follow all that. They're going to follow the laws that are in front of them. And if you don't have capable people following, doing that permitting and licensing process, then it could all go off the rails really quickly.
So I'll add one thing to this. One of the issues is actually on the African side of the equation, right? You actually have a lack of harmonization for different types of standards that would dictate supply chain development that is very important for investment across countries, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. So local content, it's a really simple one to point to, but those requirements are not the same in every country. And so if I'm going to try to develop a supply chain that I have points of access either through a port or a mine or other things that's going to cross a border, it creates a massive issue for me as an investor. The other thing, and fortunately I will say there is an effort to engage in that across multiple governments in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. I'm very aware of that. But the other thing is capital chases returns. That's like, if you don't walk away from any conversation I'm ever involved with anything but that is the most important thing you need to remember. Because if the returns aren't there, capital will go to where they are. Mm-hmm. And so ultimately you need to examine the landscape that you're looking to put money into to figure out whether or not it's viable relative to other opportunities. It's not just that it clears a hurdle, does it clear a hurdle sufficiently so that it's attractive to capital given all of the other opportunities that are out there. Can't tell you how many conversations I've had with leaders from other parts of the world that say, we have a great resource, why don't people just invest? And it's like, okay, we got to hit reset on this conversation because that's not what drives investment.
This is true in the United States too.
Absolutely.
It's true across the states, other jurisdictions. Gabe?
Yeah, just 30 seconds. So I almost think of this at an even more fundamental level. And to be frank, this is something that current U.S. policy would totally destroy what I'm about to say. When I look at, if we just pick Africa as a region of choice, and, we're talking a place with 3.5 times the aggregate population in the United States, dozens of different countries. If we had something where you had 50,000 students a year, when we think about the technical and the human capital base coming here and being educated here and then fanning back out, that's the kind of model I'm thinking of. And in case you're wondering how this looks in a somewhat different context, think of all the elite leaderships in the Gulf states and how many of those were educated at Georgetown and UC and UCLA and so UT and so forth, and look at the benefits that yields for both sides in practice. That's the vision I have, but unless something dramatically changes, this is something that probably recommences on January 20th, 2029.
Look, educating foreign nationals is the most powerful foreign policy tool the U.S. has. Yeah. It just is.
Yeah.
That's probably a good one to close on. Let me just say though, and so from the School of Hard Knocks, I totally agree with this. And on all of our USAID and State Department agreements that I implemented over the years, that was one of the key things that we could bring to the table. I mean, if you're at one of our universities, this is, you know, a lot of the USAID pass-throughs were for higher education support. The percentage of people that would go home was pitifully small. And that's the other piece that has to get worked on. We bring people here, we somehow have to help pave the way for them to go back and bring the knowledge and expertise back. Otherwise, we're not doing what we need to do. And I saw that too often to not be concerned about it. I mean, it is something that we need to think about. That was such a great question in so many ways, because really everything that you all said, that we've talked about, applies to every geography and every situation. I want to just say that going forward, in terms of practical things that are going to be happening, one, Africa is a big focus for our knowledge partnership with the Future Minerals Forum for this next round. So that's something that we're going to have to think about a bit more. A good friend, a person who's become a very good friend, Mark Kudufani, who was the CEO at Anglo American, one of the major mining companies, and what I'm really doing is playing secretary to Mark to get his knowledge out there and his experience out there, because one of the ideas is this is nation building stuff. So if you go into a country that has insufficient infrastructure, you're trying to improve those conditions for investment, you're trying to provide a basis for a return. Too often the governments focus on the rents, the economic rents from extraction, and not the benefits associated with building the infrastructure, making it work, protecting it, managing it, all of that sort of stuff. And going forward into the future, however it works out, whatever materials we use from wherever, I agree with him, this really has to be a front and center. And it's a way of helping the mining industry, because if governments can realize what really is getting created in value for their societies, maybe the conversations will be better and it'll be more durable. And then the last thing I wanted to say, because I didn't say this earlier, I did sort of want to announce an effort that we're making here at the center to bring some new tools into the mix, what we're calling strategic gaming, kind of borrowing from the war game tradition. These things are so complicated, all of the stuff we've talked about today. And we're trying to think about new ways of dealing with all of that complexity, especially when it comes to the practical things that can be done to deepen markets and make them more robust, and specifically to deal with some very, very existential is probably a good word to use for that, considerations that we have on the national security front. So with that, I'm going to call this to an end. So if anybody out there had a really compelling question, email it. We're out there.
Come on up.
Come on up. We've got a few minutes, and certainly, you know, if you want to follow up on something with anybody who was here this morning, you know, don't hesitate to do so. I want to thank Ken for backing this and providing both the moral support as well as all of the other resources that we need to engage in all the stuff we're doing, and helping me to get this off the ground. And everybody who was here today participating, tons of thanks. Y'all were great. And I hope the audience will join me in thanking you, because I think everybody got something out of it.